Chapter 6. Attack and Defense, Bekker, Henry Moore, and Goadby. The sands of my existence are running down. What was once solid ground begins to tremble under my feet, and yet no pitched battle has been fought. To all outward appearance, my empire is as wide and my throne as firmly set as ever. If any disposition to yield on the part of my sacerdotal supporters has become manifest, it is only in consequence of the piercingness of my own eye, from which, as you may judge, my loving friend, few things are wholly hidden. In reality, however, I feel that the joints and bands of my existence are undergoing dissolution. And as I wish to communicate my own knowledge to you, I proceed to put before you two antagonists and one advocate of no ordinary metal, who have their proper logical place at the point to which we have now arrived. Balthasar Bekker, a Dutch Protestant clergyman, was the first to strike a heavy blow at the pestiferous superstitions connected with witchcraft, belief in apparitions and other supposed operations in human society of the devil and his angels, which, alas, still haunt and worry the less enlightened classes in both hemispheres. Dr. Bekker was born on the 20th of March, 1634, in a Friesland village, of which his father was the minister. Having been initiated into the elements of learning by that parent, he studied in the colleges of Groningen and Frankfurt, where he made such progress in scholarship as to be thought at a later day not unworthy to receive the honorable title of Doctor of Divinity. As a country parson at Oosterlittens, in Friesland, he devoted himself earnestly to his sacred duties, and manifested special interest in the instruction of children, which was neglected throughout the province. For this important purpose he established a species of Sunday school. As an aid to his instructional efforts, he published a short catechism for children, and another for persons of more advanced age. These praiseworthy labors excited envy in some of his clerical brethren, whose indifference to the wants of the people seemed to be reproved by Bekker's intelligent zeal. A cry was raised against him. Being a student of this philosophy of Descartes, then feared by traditionalists, he was described as an enemy to religion. The charge was sustained out of his second catechism, which fell under the clerical ban as containing strange expressions, unscriptural positions and dangerous opinions. His assailants went so far as to charge him with socialism, which at that time was a serious crime in Holland, now among the freest lands of Europe and America, whether for religious or social liberality. The annoyances he underwent in consequence of his righteous endeavors, induced him to leave Friesland, and, after a change of place or two, he settled in Amsterdam, 1679. The comet which appeared in 1680 and 1681, and which terrified the world, called forth from him another manly utterance in his Onderzoek over de Komedie, or Inquiry concerning comets, wherein he attempted to calm men's minds by shewing that comets are not the presages or forerunners of calamity. This piece gained him great reputation, as did his exposition on the prophet Daniel, in which he gave abundant evidence of learning and sound judgment. But the work on which his fame is built is his Betuwerde Wereld, the World Bewitched. What led him to write this important work was, as he declares in its preface, his grief to see the great honors, powers, and miracles which are ascribed to the devil. It has come to pass, he says, that men think it piety and godliness to ascribe a great many wonders to the devil, and impiety and heresy if a man will not believe that the devil can do what 1,000 persons affirm he does. It is now reckoned religious if a man who fears God fears the devil also. If he is not afraid of the devil, he passes for an atheist, because he cannot think that there are two gods, the one good, the other bad. But these, I think, with much more reason, may be called ditheists, believers in two gods. For my part, if on account of my opinion they will give me a new name, let them call me a monotheist, for I am a believer in but one God. The object of the work, according to its author, was to strip the devil of his power, and to drive him back from earth to hell. Guided by the Cartesian doctrine, which places the essence of spirits in the faculty of thought, he expressly denied the operation of evil spirits on human beings, and described the references to good angels in the Scripture as figurative representations of the agency of God. In a scriptural confession of his belief, which he laid before the upper consistory of Amsterdam, He denies the existence of angels as well as that of devils, but without giving his reasons. More emphatic are his declarations against the popular falsities which tell of covenants with the devil, of magic, of witchcraft, of ghosts, of demoniacal possessions, and repudiating altogether the kingdom of Satan, to which was attributed a power equal to, if not greater than, that of the Creator. He shews how that Scripture does not propound or set forth any doctrine or view of the devil as a matter of belief, but finding the notion already in existence, makes use of it for its own purposes. There are, he states, many things in Scripture on which no information is given and no acceptance demanded, e.g., the Urim and Thummim. The Bible is not given to teach us the nature of things or their real existence, but to shew us them in their relation to God and our own good. In other words, its position is not a strictly scientific one, but a religious and practical one. Accordingly, much of what is said of the devil must be looked on as faded flowers, and even the temptation of Christ, Bekker explains as an alternation of opposite thoughts which determine Jesus in favor of duty in its highest claims. The passage in 1 Peter v. 8, which describes the devil as a roaring lion which walketh about seeking whom he may devour, makes reference to the Emperor Nero. Many other things which the Bible says of the devil, are to be understood of men. Instead of the fear of the devil, this wise man and true minister of Christ recommends the fear of God, yea, by banishing the fear of the devil from men's hearts, the wisdom and power of the Saviour will only become the more signal. The advanced position which he took up in theology is manifested in the fact, that he does not suppress reason by Scripture, nor Scripture by reason, but declares them two equally legitimate powers. His work speedily excited attention, and was soon put out in a translation in French. Forthwith arose a general clamor. Bitter tongues soon produced injurious deeds. The clerical authorities of Amsterdam proceeded against the daring heretic who did not even spare their falsities in his zeal to emancipate his fellow men from imaginary terrors. Having first suspended him from the Holy Communion of the Supper, they, on finding him intractable, deposed him from the ministerial office, 1692. The magistrates of Amsterdam, however, being more merciful than his ecclesiastical brethren, paid him his salary as long as he lived. His deposition did not satisfy his assailants. They excommunicated him. Driven from their church, he sought shelter and sympathy among the French Protestant refugees settled in Holland. And so he remained faithful to his published convictions down to the day of his death, which took place June 11, 1698. He passed onwards in the faith and hope of a simple-minded and earnest Christian. As an illustration of the extremes to which his persecutors went, reference may be made to a medal which they struck at the time of his deposition, and which represented the devil, clad like a clergyman, riding upon an ass, and holding in his hand a banner, in sarcastic reference to the victory he had gained in the ecclesiastical assemblies. With the medal was published a small piece in Dutch to explain its import, by stating what had been done in the consistory classes and synods. While, however, the clergy cursed and sneered, impartial persons declared that his morals were pure, and his soul firm and unyielding. The great philosopher Locke felt and expressed an interest in the unjust treatment Bekker underwent. And while Collins, in his discourse on free thinking, attributed the prevalence of belief in diabolical agency to the influence of priests, and its decline to a freedom of thinking encouraged at the Revolution, Dr. Bentley, in his remarks on that composition, observes, "What has lessened in England your stories of sorceries? Not the growing sect of atheists, but the growth of philosophy and medicine. No thanks to atheists, but to the Royal Society and College of Physicians, to the Bales and Newtons, the Sydenhams and Ratcliffes." When the people saw the diseases they had imputed to witchcraft quite cured by a course of physic, they too were cured of their former error. They learned truth by the event 3, not by a false position a priori that there was neither witch nor devil. And then as to the frauds and impostures in this way, they have most of them been detected by the clergy. The two strongest books I have read on this subject were both written by priests, the one by Dr. Bekker in Holland, and the other by a doctor whose name I forgot, that was afterwards Archbishop of York. 5 years before the death of Bekker, a man of high culture and of lasting fame, a clerk of the Church of England and a distinguished member of the University of Cambridge, the Platonic spiritualist, Henry More, passed from what had been to him a world of reverie into the world of everlasting realities, on the 1st of September, 1687. If Bekker's words were the first breath of the new life that was then coming forth, More's words were the last thorough and unconscious wail over the then dying past. Not that I was in those days gasping for breath. But mine was already, except with the ignorant, a mutilated existence. Men believed and doubted, and so ceased to tremble. Of course the priests grew alarmed. If I were gone, what would become of them? I with them? To deny the devil was to deny God. The incoming deluge must be damned out. Among those who put their hands to the task was the Eve. Henry More in his Antidote to Atheism. If the extracts that I am about to lay before you create astonishment, as proceeding from so learned and cultivated a divine, you, my attentive and intelligent listener, may judge how thick and murky must have been the darkness of the popular mind under the oppressive incubus, especially when you know that the author was a member of that school of what is called the latitudinarian divines, whose legitimate successors are in the present day Arnold, Hare, Whately, Maurice, Kingsley, Alford, Conybeare and Howson, and last, but by no means least, Stanley, Dean of Westminster, the comparatively free and brave. In Book 3 of his Antidote against Atheism, Henry More speaks, p. 170, as of a matter of truth, of a witch, who to satisfy the curiosity of them that could punish her, was set free, that she might give a proof of that power she professed she had to raise tempests. She therefore, being let go, betakes herself to a place thick set with trees, scrapes a hole with her hand, fills it with urine, and stirs it about so long, that she caused at last a thick dark cloud charged with thunder and lightning, to the terror and distress of the beholders. However, she bids them to be of good courage, for she will command the cloud to discharge its contents upon what spot they should name, which promise she made good in the sight of the spectators. In the same place he tells of a young girl, who to please her father, complaining of a drought, raised a cloud that watered his ground only, all around remaining as dry as before. He tells also of 2 persons who, having by the power of the devil coursed aloft in the air, were cast headlong out of a cloud upon a house. One of them being but a novice, and inexperienced in those supernatural exploits, was astounded and afraid. But the other, being used to such feats from his youth, his parents having devoted him from his childhood to the devil, did but make a sport of it, and, laughing at his friend, called him a fool for his fear, bidding him be of good courage. For their master, in whose power they were, would carry them safe through greater dangers than those. And no sooner had he said these words than a whirlwind seized them and set them both safe upon the ground, but the house they were carried from so shook as if it would have been overturned from the very foundations. He adds another relation of a witch, by name Constance, who being vexed that all her neighbors in the village where she lived were invited to a wedding, and so were drinking, dancing and making merry, while she was solitary and neglected, got the devil to transport her through the air, in the midst of day, to a hill hard by the village, where, digging a hole and putting urine into it, she raised a great tempest, and directed it so that it fell upon, and only upon, the village, and pelted them that were dancing with that violence that they were forced to discontinue their sport. Another instance is related of a man, who at the persuasion of his wife anointing himself, as she had done before him, was carried away in the air to a great assembly of wizards and witches, where they were feasting under a nut tree. But this stranger, not relishing his cheer without salt, besought that condiment, and at last the salt came, when he blessed God for it. At that name the whole assembly disappeared, and he, poor man, was left alone naked 100 miles from home. The learned and refined clerk, after giving these and many other similar narratives, says, I have produced such narrations that cannot but gain credit with such as are not perversely and wilfully incredulous. In another chapter, p. 232, the doctor speaks of men transformed into wolves by the devil, and argues for its being a real transformation, not a delusion of the fancy. For I conceive, says he, that the devil gets into their body, and by his subtle substance, more operative and searching than any fire or purifying liquor, melts the yielding compages of the body to such a consistency, and so much of it as is fit for his purpose, and makes it pliable to his imagination. And then it is as easy for him to work it into what shape he pleaseth, as it is to work the air into such forms and figures as he ordinarily doth. Nor is it any more difficulty for him to modify what is hard, than it is to harden what is soft and fluid as the air. And he that hath this power, we can never stick to give him what is lesser, viz. to instruct men how they shall for a time forsake their bodies and come in his reign. For can it be a hard thing for him that can thus melt and take in pieces the particles of the body, to have the skill and power to loosen the soul, a substance really distinct from the body, and separable from it? Which is at last done by the easy course of nature, at that final dissolution of soul and body which we call death. But no course of nature ever transforms the body of man into the shape of a wolf, so that this is more hard and exorbitant from the order of nature than the other. Pause here, my beloved pupil, pause and reflect. These are the opinions of a scholar, a divine, a philosopher, and a good man. They are not to be slighted. Yet consider how such convictions cut into the very flesh, bone and marrow of ordinary life, and what torture, distress and confusion they must have inflicted on individuals, homes, society, the state, the church. Still to this hour the kernel of all this mass of living corruption retains some life. Religion, the heart and the soul of man, is perplexed and horrified with these terrors. God's own universe is not in God's hands, nor does he fill infinite space and time with his presence. Everywhere he is beset with a competitor who throws his order into disorder, his law into suspension, his behests into contempt, his happiness into misery, his peace into confusion and warfare. Say, then, if it is not a sign of my taking a turn for the better, when I thus come forward and, through yon, explode the whole as a pestiferous mass of human folly and fraud. Had those who by profession are sons of the light not loved their own darkness rather than God's light, come forward and swept these Augean stables with their own hand, I should have been content to retire silently into well-merited oblivion. But no. The example of the Reverend Doctor Moore shews how little there is to be expected from the priests. I make this qualification in acknowledgment of the just reported services rendered by the Reverend Balthasar Bekker. And I have taken up this tone in order to introduce to you a name which, when the true lights of the world shall find recognition, will shine as a star in the firmament. Not long after the time when Moore was darkening counsel with words without knowledge in England, and Bekker was opening the eyes of thousands on the continent, there lived, worked and wrote at Sherborne, in Dorsetshire, a humble printer, by name R. Goadby, who put forth and widely circulated what he called an illustration of the Holy Scriptures, in 4 large folio volumes, containing above 3,000 pages of matter, partly collected, partly original, in which are found the seeds of many of the most advanced ideas of the present day. Among other passages of similar tendency, the following, which bears directly on our theme, deserves respectful attention as the first free and emphatic utterance in England against this, the most prolific and baneful of superstitions. Another, I quote Mr. Goadby's words, preface to his Illustration of the New Testament, p. 4, another little less important and little less certain truth, than that, the Almighty rather of the universe made heaven, and earth, and sea, and all that in them is, without any coadjutor, upon which true religion must be founded is that God only reigneth supreme. That he hath prepared his throne in the heavens and his kingdom ruleth over all, P.S. c. 19, that there is no evil being in the universe, who vies in power with him, and is in declared opposition against him. That there is no being of superior order that can injure or draw to evil and bring to eternal misery the human nature, for this would degrade God from the character of a father, a master and a sovereign. For how can he be a father if he suffers his children to be injured or drawn to evil by any being of far superior power, who attacks them in a manner they know not how, who is about their paths and about their bed, and they know it not? Whom on the left hand, where he doth work, they cannot behold, who hideth himself on the right hand that they cannot see him? And how is God a master, if he suffers another, in declared opposition to him, to bring his servants into subjection, to turn them to his will, or to use them despitefully. How is he the all-powerful sovereign, if another, in declared opposition to him, can harass and ruin his subjects, can frustrate his intentions for their good, and introduce disorder and misery into his kingdom? Or where is his power, if he is under a necessity of using the power and malevolence of an evil being, and even his declared enemy, to punish his subjects? Does he who, as his prophet speaks of him, can smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and slay the wicked with the breath of his lips, stand in need of the assistance of his enemy to punish his rebellious subjects? Or does he who knows all things from the beginning to the end, need his aid to try their fidelity by temptations? Will he who has declared by his prophets that he will not give his glory to another, enable a malevolent being to do as mighty acts as himself? For such and even mightier have men, and even the learned, attributed to the devil. How is it possible there should be concord between God and an evil being, between the most perfect and adorable goodness and the extremest and most detestable malignity? If it be said that God does not assist or enable this evil being to do what he is supposed to do in the world, but only permits it, then it must follow that he has the power in himself, and if so, then it may be asked, which is God? Since, as is supposed, they shew equal acts of power. If it be said that all the good we experience comes from God, all the evil from the devil, what is this but to set up two gods, a good one and an evil one? And do we not by this contradict God himself, who has expressly declared by his prophets, form the light and create darkness, I make peace and create evil, I the Lord do all these things? Is 14:7. Let us not deem so unworthily of the great Father of the universe, the infinite, pure and perfect Spirit, as that he associates with himself, or employs in any manner, a malignant being, exercising a power superior to nature, and doing as God does. Let us not have so low conceptions of his almighty power and all-perfect wisdom, as to imagine that there is always existing any being throughout the whole universe in an open, declared opposition against him, and always endeavoring to injure and destroy his works. Let us have higher and more just thoughts of the Almighty's justice and goodness than to imagine he sets so vastly powerful and malignant a being, as is supposed, in competition against weak man, the potsherd of the earth, who is, as imagined, so greatly inferior to this evil being, that the famous Luther once said, though I had with me 100,000 men such as myself, I could not resist one devil. Let us ask ourselves how any such notions are consistent with the doxology Christ has taught us to address daily to the Father of the universe, thine is the kingdom, the power and the glory. It is a fine illustration of the way in which a simple, rational and devout piety may rise in purity of religious conception to the altitude of the highest art, that is offered in Goadby's view of the temptation of Christ, which embodies in words the idea embodied by Schaeffer in one of the greatest of paintings, see the cover. Denying a personal devil in what may be called an essay on the scriptural account of that most expressive and salutary mental process. This intelligent and most laborious tradesman declares that the spirit by which Jesus was led into the wilderness was the Spirit of God, and consequently that he was under God's influence and guidance. In this state of soul Jesus passed through certain pictures, or vivid states of thought, which represented as many trials which would beset him in his public ministry. Contemplating the forecast of these his coming perils, he learned how, with God's aid and the aid of Scripture, to put away the inferior, though full of earthly promise, and to accept the superior, though full of earthly pain, contempt, and even death. He thus freely chose the better way. In the language of the day, he owned God and repelled Satan. In plain English, he in the greatest of all issues rejected evil and embraced good. To cite my author's own words, why, it might have been suggested to him, instead of spending your life in affliction and then ending it upon the cross, will you not use your power for your own benefit, and make yourself master of the world? But this temptation did not at any time prevail over our Lord, notwithstanding the desire of honor, wealth and dominion, is natural to every human mind, and is with greater difficulty than any other subjected to the control of reason and conscience. And notwithstanding universal empire carries with it charms almost irresistible, especially to noble and heroic minds conscious of their superior wisdom and abilities. and an intention to employ their power to the true ends for which it was bestowed. If anything can heighten the virtue of despising worldly greatness when it comes in competition with our duty, it is the being practiced in circumstances of indigence. And therefore to refuse, as our Saviour did, the offer of grandeur and royalty and universal empire, while he was struggling with poverty, reproach and persecution in the cause of God, was the highest act of virtue that humanity could exhibit. This account of the temptation of Christ obviates all the objections made to the common interpretation, and justifies the wisdom of God in this dispensation. It is not a series of external occurrences, some of them absurd and impossible, all of them useless and improbable, but an internal vision, like that of the Apostle Peter, Acts 11, and this is ascribed, not to a diabolical, but to a divine agency, agreeably to its instructive and beneficial design and tendency. The several scenes of which it is composed do each of them contain a real trial, such as occasioned a very bright display of the virtue and piety of Jesus. If, besides the probationary nature, we take into our account the symbolical design of this vision, it was a proper preparation for that important office with which Christ was now invested. With what divine skill are the scenes of this vision framed, so as to answer both these purposes? What just ground then do they afford for censure? One, the account which has been given serves to exalt the character of Christ and to confirm our faith in his divine mission. Mr. Goadby also shews in the same connection how the removal of scriptural difficulties tends to lessen the prevalence of skepticism and unbelief. Most true and important are his words. Intents of existing doubt and disbelief in regard to Christianity are born and bred of an acceptance more or less real and vivid of my personality. Yes, the very men that ought in their teachings to exhibit the religion of Jesus in all its divine and human simplicity and acceptableness, obstruct and prevent its spread by old wives' fables begotten of ignorance and superstition. And yet Christ said of himself, I am the light of the world, he that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life, John 8:12. How can such an averment be reconciled with popery as depicted by Pio Nono in his recently issued syllabus, in which he pronounces a curse on modern civilization, one, as if that culture were not a blessing from the hands of divine providence, bestowed in reward partly of opposition to Romanism, and chiefly in repayment of mental freedom, moral integrity, and personal energy and devotement such as have never before been witnessed on earth. Chapter 7. Efforts for my revival, Defoe, Wesley and Doddridge. The 17th and 18th centuries witnessed a great and rapid decline in the belief of my personal existence. Not, however, without serious opposition was its demolition to he effected. The professional ministers of religion, whether papal or Protestant, had long been assured that the interests of their faith and ministry were welded together with the belief in the various lines and manners of action ascribed to me in connection with alchemy, necromancy, apparitions and witchcraft. Accordingly, in their opinion, to contradict these unrealities was to endanger Christianity. Hence ensued a new batch of spiritualistic falsities. The tendency of the period is illustrated by the trick played by the celebrated Defoe on the credulousness of his age. One Dr. Drelincourt had written a treatise on death. The subject, not one of the most attractive, consigned the lucubrations of the pious author to total neglect. The sheets of the work lay a heavy burden on the publisher's shelves. But publishers have their resources in cases of a bad investment. And might not a loss be turned into a gain, perhaps a considerable one, if the popular author of Robinson Crusoe could be induced to write a preface to the heavy and cumbrous volume? He undertook the task, and produced a ghost story which was so simply and naturally told as to defy disbelief. While in its tenor it put to flight all the objections taken by the active and daring infidels of the day to the existence of another and invisible world. The narrative is too characteristic of the manner in which, from being the offspring of speculation, fancy and fear, I have become a divinity, to be omitted in this my natural history. A true relation of the apparition of one Mrs. Yule, the next day after her death, to one Mrs. Bargrave, at Canterbury, the 8th of September, 1705, which apparition recommends the perusal of Drelincourt's Book of Consolations against the years of death. This thing is so rare in all its circumstances, and on so good authority, that my reading and conversation has not given me anything like it. It is fit to gratify the most ingenious and serious inquirer. Mrs. Bargrave is the person to whom Mrs. Veal appeared after her death. She is my intimate friend, and I can vouch for her reputation for these last 15 or 16 years on my own knowledge, and I can confirm the good character she had from her youth to the time of my acquaintance. Though, since this relation, she is calumniated by some people that are friends to the brother of Mrs. Yule who appeared, who think the relation of this appearance to be a reflection, and endeavour what they can to blast Mrs. Bargrave's reputation and to laugh the story out of countenance. But by the circumstance thereof, and the cheerful disposition of Mrs. Bargrave, notwithstanding the ill usage of a very wicked husband, there is not yet the least sign of dejection on her face, nor did I ever hear her let fall a desponding or murmuring expression. Nay, not when actually under her husband's barbarity, which I have been a witness to, and several other persons of undoubted reputation. Now you must know that Mrs. Veal was a maiden gentlewoman of about 30 years of age, and for some years last past had been troubled with fits, which were perceived coming on her by her going off her discourse very abruptly to some impertinence. She was maintained by an only brother, and kept his house in Dover. She was a very pious woman, and her brother a very sober man to all appearance, but now he does all he can to null and quash the story. Mrs. Veal was intimately acquainted with Mrs. Bargrave from her childhood. Mrs. Veal's circumstances were then mean. Her father did not take care of his children as he ought, so that they were exposed to hardships. And Mrs. Bargrave in those days had as unkind a father, though she wanted neither for food nor clothing, while Mrs. Yule wanted for both, insomuch that she would often say, "Mrs. Bargrave, you are not only the best, but the only friend I have in the world. And no circumstance of life shall ever dissolve my friendship." They would condole each other's adverse fortunes, and read together Drelincourt upon Death, and other good books. And so, like two Christian friends, they comforted each other under their sorrow. Some time after, Mr. Veal's friends got him a place in the custom house at Dover, which occasioned Mrs. Veal, by little and little, to fall off from her intimacy with Mrs. Bargrave, though there never was any such thing as a quarrel, but an indifferency came on by degrees, till at last Mrs. Bargrave had not seen her in 2 years and a half, though above 12 months of the time Mrs. Bargrave hath been absent from Dover, and this last half year has been in Canterbury about 2 months of the time, dwelling in a house of her own. In this house, on the 8th of September, 1705, she was sitting alone in the forenoon, thinking over her unfortunate life, and arguing herself into a due resignation to Providence, though her condition seemed hard. "And," said she, "I have been provided for hitherto, and doubt not but I shall be still, and am well satisfied that my afflictions shall end when it is most fit for me." And then took up her sewing work, which she had no sooner done but she hears a knocking at the door. She went to see who was there, and this proved to be Mrs. Veal, her old friend, who was in a riding habit. At that moment of time the clock struck 12 at noon. "Madam," says Mrs. Bargrave, "I am surprised to see you, you have been so long a stranger," but told her she was glad to see her, and offered to salute her, which Mrs. Veal complied with, till their lips almost touched, and then Mrs. Veal drew her hand across her own eyes, and said, "I am not very well," and so waved it. She told Mrs. Bargrave she was going a journey, and had a great mind to see her first. "But," says Mrs. Bargrave, "how can you take a journey alone?" "I am amused at it, because I know you have a fond brother." "Oh," says Mrs. Veal, "I gave my brother the slip and came away, because I had so great a desire to see you before I took my journey." So Mrs. Bargrave went in with her into another room within the first, and Mrs. Veal sat her down in an elbow chair in which Mrs. Bargrave was sitting when she heard Mrs. Veal knock. "Then," says Mrs. Veal, "my dear friend, I am come to renew our old friendship again, and beg your pardon for my breach of it, and if you can forgive me, you are the best of women." "Oh," says Mrs. Bargrave, "do not mention such a thing, I have not had an uneasy thought about it, I can easily forgive it." "What did you think of me, V?" says Mrs. Veal. Says Mrs. Bargrave. "I thought you were like the rest of the world, and that prosperity had made you forget yourself and me." Then Mrs. Veal reminded Mrs. Bargrave of the many friendly offices she did in her former days, and much of the conversation they had with each other in the times of their adversity. What books they read, and what comfort in particular they received from Drelincourt's Book of Death, which was the best, she said, on the subject ever wrote. She also mentioned Dar. Sherlock, and 2 Dutch books which were translated, wrote upon death, and several others. But Drelincourt, she said, had the clearest notions of death and of the future state of any who had handled the subject. Then she asked Mrs. Bargrave whether she had Drelincourt. She said, yes. Said Mrs. Veal, fetch it. And so Mrs. Bargrave goes upstairs and brings it down. Says Mrs. Veal, dear Mrs. Bargrave, if the eyes of our faith were as open as the eyes of our body, we should see numbers of angels about us for our guard. The notions we have of heaven now are nothing like what it is, as Drelincourt says. Therefore be comforted under your afflictions, and believe that the Almighty has a particular regard to you, and that your afflictions are marks of God's favor. And when they have done the business they were sent for, they shall be removed from you. And believe me, my dear friend, believe what I say to Jan, 1 minute of future happiness will infinitely reward you for all your sufferings. For I can never believe, and claps her hands upon her knees with great earnestness, which indeed she did through most of her discourse, that ever God will suffer you to spend all your days in this afflicted state. But be assured that your sufferings shall leave you or you them in a short time. She spake in that pathetical and heavenly manner, that Mrs. Bargrave wept several times, she was so deeply affected with it. Then Mrs. Veal mentioned Dr. Kenrick's ascetic, at the end of which he gives an account of the lives of the primitive Christians. Their pattern she recommended to our imitation, and said, their conversation was not like this of our age. For now, says she, there is nothing but vain frothy discourse, which is far different from theirs. Theirs was to edification, and to build one another up in faith, so that they were not as we are, nor are we as they were. But, said she, we ought to do as they did, there was a hearty friendship among them, but where is it now to be found? V. says Mrs. Bargrave, it is hard indeed to find a true friend in these days. Says Mrs. Veal, Mr. Norris has a fine copy of verses, called Friendship in Perfection, which I wonderfully admire. Have you seen the book? P. says Mrs. Veal. No, says Mrs. Bargrave, but I have the verses of my own writing out. Have you? Says Mrs. Veal. Then fetch them, which she did from above stairs, and offered them to Mrs. Veal to read, who refused, and waved the thing, saying holding down her head would make it ache, and then desiring Mrs. Bargrave to read them to her, which she did. As they were admiring friendship, Mrs. Veal said, Dear Mrs. Bargrave, I shall love you forever. In these verses there is twice used the word Elysian. Ah, says Mrs. Veal, these poets have such names for heaven. She would often draw her hand across her own eyes, and say, Mrs. Bargrave, do not you think I am mightily impaired by my fits? No, says Mrs. Bargrave, I think you look as well as ever I saw you. After this discourse, which the apparition put in much finer words than Mrs. Bargrave said she could pretend to, and as much more than she can remember, for it cannot be thought that an hour and 3/4 conversation could all be retained, though the main of it she thinks she does, she said to Mrs. Bargrave that she would have her write a letter to her brother, and tell him she would have him give rings to such and such, and that there was a purse of gold in her cabinet, and that she would have 2 broad pieces given to her cousin, Watson. Talking at this rate, Mrs. Bargrave thought that a fit was coming on her, and so placed herself on a chair just before her knees, to keep her from falling to the ground, if her fits should occasion it. For the elbow chair, she thought, would keep her from falling on either side. And to divert Mrs. Veal, as she thought, Mrs. Bargrave took hold of her gown sleeve several times, and commended it. Mrs. Veal told her it was a scoured silk, and lately made up. But for all this, Mrs. Veal persisted in her request, and told Mrs. Bargrave she must not deny her. And she would have her tell her brother all their conversation when she had opportunity. "Dear Mrs. Veal," says Mrs. Bargrave, "this seems so impertinent that I cannot tell how to comply with it, and what a mortifying story will our conversation be to a young gentleman." "Why," says Mrs. Bargrave, "it is much better, methinks, to do it yourself." "No," says Mrs. Veal, "though it seems impertinent to you now, you will see more reasons for it hereafter." Mrs. Bargrave then, to satisfy her importunity, was going to fetch a pen and ink. But Mrs. Veal said, "Let it alone now, and do it when I am gone, but you must be sure to do it," which was one of the last things she enjoined her at parting, and so she promised her. Then Mrs. Veal asked for Mrs. Bargrave's daughter. She said she was not at home. "But if you have a mind to see her," says Mrs. Bargrave, "I'll send for her." "Do," says Mrs. Veal, on which she left her and went to a neighbour's house to see her, and by the time Mrs. Bargrave was returning, Mrs. Veal was got without in the street, in the face of the Heast Market, on a Saturday, which is market day, and stood ready to part as soon as Mrs. Bargrave came to her. She asked her why she was in such haste. She said she must be going, though perhaps she might not go her journey till Monday, and told Mrs. Bargrave she hoped she would see her again at her cousin Watson's, before she went whither she was going. Then she said she would take her leave of her, and walked from Mrs. Bargrave in her view, till a turning interrupted the sight of her, which was 1:45 in the afternoon. Mrs. Yule died the 7th of September, at 12 o'clock at noon, of her fits, and had not above 4 hours' senses before her death, in which time she received the sacrament. The next day after Mrs. Yale's appearance, being Sunday, Mrs. Bargrave was mightily indisposed with a cold and a sore throat, so that she could not go out that day, but on Monday morning she sends a person to Captain Watson's, to know if Mrs. Yale was there. They wondered at Mrs. Bargrave's inquiry, and sent her word she was not there, nor was expected. At this answer, Mrs. Bargrave told the maid she had certainly mistook the name, or made some blunder. And though she was ill, she put on her hood, and went herself to Captain Watson's, though she knew none of the family, to see if Mrs. Yale was there or not. They said they wondered at her asking, for she had not been in town. They were sure, if she had, she would have been there. Says Mrs. Bargrave, "I am sure she was with me on Saturday almost 2 hours." They said it was impossible, for they must have seen her if she had. In comes Captain Watson while they were in dispute, and said that Mrs. Yale was certainly dead and the escutcheons were making. This strangely surprised Mrs. Bargrave, when she went to the person immediately who had the care of them, and found it true. Then she related the whole story to Captain Watson's family, and what gown she had on, and how striped, and that Mrs. Yale told her that it was scoured. Then Mrs. Watson cried out, "You have seen her indeed, for none knew but Mrs. Veal and myself that the gown was scoured." And Mrs. Watson owned that she described the gown exactly, for, said she, "I helped her to make it up." This Mrs. Watson blazed all about the town, and avouched the demonstration of the truth of Mrs. Bargrave seeing Mrs. Veal's apparition. And Captain Watson carried 2 gentlemen immediately to Mrs. Bargrave's house, to hear the relation from her own mouth. And when it spread so fast, that gentlemen and persons of quality, the judicious and skeptical part of the world, flocked in upon her, it at last became such a task, that she was forced to go out of the way. For they were in general extremely satisfied of the truth of the thing, and plainly saw that Mrs. Bargrave was no hypochondriac, for she always appears with such a cheerful air and pleasing mien, that she has gained the favour and esteem of all the gentry, and it is thought a great favour if they can but get the relation from her own mouth. I should have told you before that Mrs. Veal told Mrs. Bargrave that her sister and brother-in-law were just come down from London to see her. Says Mrs. Bargrave, "How came you to order matters so strangely?" "It could not be helped," said Mrs. Veal. And her brother and sister did come down to see her, and entered the town of Dover just as Mrs. Veal was expiring. Mrs. Bargrave asked her whether she would drink some tea. Says Mrs. Veal, "I do not care if I do. But I'll warrant you this mad fellow," meaning Mrs. Bargrave's husband, "has broke all your trinkets." But, says Mrs. Bargrave, I'll get something to drink in for all that, but Mrs. Veal waved it and said, it is no matter, let it alone. And so it passed. All the time I sat with Mrs. Bargrave, which was some hours, she recollected fresh sayings of Mrs. Veal. And one material thing more she told Mrs. Bargrave, that old Mr. Breton allowed Mrs. Veal £10 a year, which was a secret, and unknown to Mrs. Bargrave till Mrs. Veal told her. Mrs. Bargrave never varies in her story, which puzzles those who doubt of the truth, or are unwilling to believe it. A servant in the neighbor's yard adjoining to Mrs. Bargrave's house, heard her talking to somebody an hour of the time Mrs. Veal was with her. Mrs. Bargrave went out to her next neighbor's the very moment she parted with Mrs. Veal, and told her what a ravishing conversation she had had with an old friend, and told the whole of it. Drelincourt's Book of Death is, since this happened, bought up strangely. And it is to be observed, that notwithstanding all the trouble and fatigue Mrs. Bargrave has undergone upon this account, she never took the value of a farthing, nor suffered her daughter to take anything of anybody, and therefore can have no interest in telling the story. But Mr. Veal does what he can to stifle the matter, and said he would see Mrs. Bargrave, but yet is it certain matter of fact that he has been at Captain Watson's since the death of his sister, and yet never went near Mrs. Bargrave. And some of his friends report her to be a liar, and that she knew of Mr. Breton's £10 a year. But the person who pretends to say so has the reputation of being a notorious liar among persons whom I know to be of undoubted credit. Now, Mr. Veal is more of a gentleman than to say that she lies, but says a bad husband has crazed her, but she needs only present herself, and it will effectually confute that pretence. Mr. Veal says he asked his sister on her deathbed whether she had a mind to dispose of anything. And she said, no, now the things which Mrs. Veal's apparition would have disposed of, were so trifling, and nothing but justice aimed at in the disposal, that the design of it appears to me to be only in order to make Mrs. Bargrave so to demonstrate the truth of her appearance, as to satisfy the world of the reality thereof, as to what she had seen and heard, and to secure her reputation among the reasonable and understanding part of mankind. And then, again, Mr. Veal owns that there was a purse of gold, but it was not found in her cabinet, but in a comb box. This looks improbable, for that Mrs. Watson owned that Mrs. Veal was so very careful of the key of her cabinet, that she could trust nobody with it. And if so, no doubt she would not trust her gold out of it. And Mrs. Veal's often drawing her hand over her eyes, and asking Mrs. Bargrave whether her fits had not impaired her, looks to me as if she did it on purpose to remind Mrs. Bargrave of her fits, to prepare her not to think it strange that she should put her upon writing to her brother, to dispose of rings and gold, which looked so much like a dying person's request, and it took accordingly with Mrs. Bargrave as the effect of her fits coming upon her, and was one of the many instances of her wonderful love to her and care of her, that she should not be affrighted. Which indeed appears in her whole management, particularly in her coming to her in the daytime, waving the salutation, and when she was alone, and then the manner of her parting, to prevent a second attempt to salute her. Now why Mr. Veal should think this relation a reflection, as it is plain he does, by his endeavoring to stifle it, I cannot imagine. Because the generality believe her to be a good spirit, her discourse was so heavenly. Her two great errands were, to comfort Mrs. Bargrave in her affliction, and to ask her forgiveness for her breach of friendship, and with a pious discourse to encourage her. So that, after all, to suppose that Mrs. Bargrave could hatch such an invention as this from Friday noon till Saturday noon, supposing that she knew of Mrs. Veal's death the very first moment, without jumbling circumstances, and without any interest too, she must be more witty, fortunate and wicked, too, than any indifferent person, I dare say, will allow. I asked Mrs. Bargrave several times if she was sure she felt the gown. She answered modestly, if my senses be to be relied on, I am sure of it. I asked her if she heard a sound when she clapped her hands upon her knee. She said she did not remember she did, but said she appeared to be as much a substance as I did who talked with her. And I may, said she, be as soon persuaded that your apparition is talking to me now, as that I did not really see her. For I was under no manner of fear, and received Lyra as a friend, and parted with her as such. I would not, says she, give 1 farthing to make any one believe it, I have no interest in it. Nothing but trouble is entailed upon me for a long time, for aught I know, and had it not come to light by accident, it would never have been made public. But now she says she will make her own private use of it, and keep herself out of the way as much as she can, and so she has done since. She says she had a gentleman who came 30 miles to her to hear the relation, and that she had told it to a room full of people at the time. Several particular gentlemen have had the story from Mrs. Eargrave's own mouth. This thing has very much affected me, and I am as well satisfied as I am of the best grounded matter of fact. And that we should dispute matter of fact, because we cannot solve things of which we can have no certain or demonstrative notions, seems strange to me. Mrs. Eargrave's authority and sincerity alone would have been undoubted in any other case. There is the story of Mrs. Veal's apparition told in full on the best vouchers and argumentatively rounded off in every particular. I venture to say that not any of the 1001-inch stories quoted to prove my personal existence can bear comparison with this for internal probability and external demonstration. Yet Mrs. Veal's apparition is a known fiction. What else then can the other stories be but collusions, illusions, or delusions / in general? They are made up of all 3 of those deceptive influences. If Mrs. Veal's apparition is a fancy, then ghost stories and other devilisms are fancies too. But the first is known to be such consequently are the second. By a fancy, I mean a figment of the imagination set in action by morbid sentiments of some kind or other. The morbid sentiment in the Veal apparition was desire to get a literary fee. The morbid sentiment in matters satanic is a compound product of low religionism, intense credulity, overriding love of what is called the church, and a pretty strong infusion of self-interest. Defoe forged an apparition to put money into his purse. The priests forged me to sustain their priestism. The only essential difference between the two is, that Defoe knew what he did, and thought all whose opinion he valued would know it as clearly as himself. While the priests know not, or but dimly know, what they do, and in their ignorance turn bigots for what is really an eidolon of their own brain and their own position. As morals improve, cheats like that palmed off upon the credulous will become impossible. As intelligence spreads, I shall cease to be the great patron of the church. And bad as I am not so bad as not to be willing to decay and die for the sake of a pure, spiritual and disinterested religion. However, so little did John Wesley understand the true principles of the religion of Jesus, and so overrun was he with the superstitious credulity of the age, that he protested against the efforts made in his day to relieve the human breast from the bugbear of devilry. It is true likewise, says Mr. Wesley, that the English in general, and indeed most of the men in Europe, have given up all accounts of witches and apparitions as mere old wives' fables. I am sorry for it. And I willingly take this opportunity of entering my solemn protest against this violent compliment which so many that believe the Bible pay to those who do not believe it. I owe them no such service. I take knowledge, these are at the bottom of the outcry which has been raised, and with such insolence spread throughout the nation, in direct opposition not only to the Bible, but to the suffrage of the wisest and best of men in all ages and nations. They well know, whether Christians know it or not, that the giving up witchcraft is in effect giving up the Bible. And they know, on the other hand, that if but one account of the intercourse of men with separate spirits be admitted, their whole castle in the air, deism, atheism, materialism, falls to the ground. I know no reason, therefore, why we should suffer even this weapon to be wrested out of our hands. Indeed, there are numerous arguments besides which abundantly confute their vain imaginations. But we need not be hooted out of one, neither reason nor religion require this. Mr. Wesley is not the only distinguished divine that has encouraged superstition without intending it, and substantiated my existence while endeavoring to undermine my throne. Apparitions are said to arise for the very purpose of promoting Christianity. Hence the remarkable story of Colonel Gardiner's conversion, as related by Dr. Doddridge. This memorable event, says the pious writer, happened toward the middle of July, 1719. The colonel had spent the evening, and if I mistake not, it was the Sabbath, in some gay company, and had an unhappy assignation with a married woman, whom he was to attend exactly at 12. The company broke up about 11, and not judging it convenient to anticipate the time appointed, he went into his chamber to kill the tedious hour, perhaps with some amusing book, or some other way. But it very accidentally happened that he took up a religious book which his good mother or aunt had, without his knowledge, slipped into his portmanteau. It was called, if I remember the title exactly, The Christian Soldier, or Heaven Taken by Storm, and it was written by Mr. Thomas Watson. Guessing by the title of it that he would find some phrases of his own profession spiritualized in a manner which, Lie thought, might afford him some diversion, Lie resolved to dip into it, but he took no serious notice of anything it had in it. And yet while this book was in his hand an impression was made upon his mind, perhaps God only knows how, which drew after it a train of the most important and happy consequences. He thought he saw an unusual blaze of light fall upon the book while he was reading, which he at first imagined might happen by some accident in the candle. But lifting up his eyes, he apprehended, to his extreme amazement, as it were suspended in the air, a visible representation of the Lord Jesus Christ upon the cross, surrounded on all sides with a glory. And was impressed, as if a voice, or something equivalent to a voice, had come to him, to this effect, for he was not confident as to the words, O, sinner! Did I suffer this for thee, and are these thy returns? Struck with so amazing a phenomenon as this, there remained hardly any life in him, so that he sunk down in the armchair in which he sat, and continued he knew not how long insensible. The appearance issued in the conversion of Colonel Gardiner. The phenomena, about the exact nature of which, however, the reverend reporter does not seem fully certain on all points, are so many recollected images of the mind, made preternaturally vivid and impressive by the contrasted force of their sanctity and his own pollution. Not impossibly a severe fall from his horse under which the gallant soldier was suffering may have conduced to the morbid action of his mind. Doubtless the tale was devoutly believed by Dr. Doddridge, who says, It is with all solemnity that I now deliver it down to posterity, as in the sight and presence of God. And I choose deliberately to expose myself to those severe censures which the haughty but empty scorn of infidelity, or principles nearly approaching it and effectually doing its pernicious work, may very probably dictate upon the occasion. Rather than to smother a relation which may, in the judgment of my conscience, be likely to conduce so much to the glory of God, the honor of the gospel, and the good of mankind. The transmission of the story would not have been less solemn and edifying had the good doctor withheld the blow which he dealt against those who should think the phenomena explicable without intruding into the secret things of God. To impute infidelity to persons who differ from you is not the way to promote Christian truth. If the spirit of the passage is bad, the logic is not good. If Christ appeared to convert a soldier to Protestantism, he has, so Rome declares, appeared again and again to work in monks and nuns religious changes of one sort or another. Avowed unbelief is not without its miraculous attestation. When Lord Herbert of Cherbury doubted whether or not he should publish his deistical book, De Veritate Prout Distinguitur a Revelation, and he took the following expedient for ascertaining his duty. One fair day in the summer, my casement being open toward the south, I took my book De Veritate in my hand, and kneeling on my knees, devoutly said these words. O thou eternal God! Author of the light which now shines upon me, and giver of all inward illuminations, I do beseech thee, of thy infinite goodness, to pardon a greater request than a sinner ought to make. I am not satisfied enough whether I shall publish this book De Veritate. If it be for thy glory, I beseech thee give me some sign from heaven, if not, I shall suppress it. I had no sooner spoken these words, but a loud, though yet gentle, noise came from the heavens, for it was like nothing on earth, which did so comfort and cheer me, that I took my petition as granted, and that I had the sign demanded. Whereupon also I resolved to print my book. This, how strange soever it may seem, I protest before the eternal God is true. Neither am I any way superstitiously deceived herein, since I did not only clearly hear the voice, but in the serenest sky that ever I saw, being without all cloud, did, to my thinking, see the place from whence it came. It would have been more satisfactory to others had his lordship reported the words, if any, which the gentle noise conveyed. Inarticulate sounds do not say much. Unconscious credulity is the most extreme state of the disease. In so rank a soil as that of the mind of Wesley, Doddridge, Herbert, I may well have grown from a fancy and a dream into a person and a fiend, especially when my impersonation was favored by the conscious craftiness of a Defoe. Chapter 8. I am become an object of derision. There is in human nature an inherent contempt for what is base. Accordingly, men have almost in all ages taken liberties with me. If in a certain way this does credit to humanity, it works my ruin. What is laughed at becomes contemptible, and what is despised contains the seeds of its own dissolution. Only goodness in this universe possesses the attribute of everlastingness. An illustration or two of this undermining influence will give additional firmness to the logical structure I am here building up. These instances will be none the worse if they are taken from points somewhat distant from each other. In the 16th century, when a fresh breath was coming over Europe, there lived in England one, Thomas Nash, who writes himself gentleman. This scholar and penman, being more skilful in spending money than making it, bethought him of applying to me as the source whence many drew great treasures, who were no more moral than himself, and yet, as did he, vibrated constantly between contempt and fear in regard to me. Yes, he would put out a book dedicated to me, in which he would set the timid wits a-laughing at my expense, and so obtain readers, and thereby repair his shattered fortunes. Accordingly, under the name of Pierce Penniless, he writes his supplication to the devil, describing the spreading of vice, and the suppression of virtue. Pleasantly interlacked with variable delights, and pathetically intermixed with conceited eprofs. London, imprinted by Richard Johns, dwelling at the signa of the Eos and Crown, Holborn Ridge, 1592. The author describes himself and his object as follows. Opus and Usus are knocking at my door 20 times a week when I am not within, the more is the pity that such a frank gentleman as I should want. But since the dice do run so towardly on my side, I am partly provided of a remedy. For whereas those that stand most on their honor shut VP their purses, and shift verses off with court hollybread. And on the other side, a number of hypocritical hotspurs, that have God always in their mouths, will give nothing for God's sake. I have clapped up a handsome supplication to the diule, and send it by a good fellow that I know will deliver it. Having thus introduced to you my petitioner, I shall read to you what there is in his petition which bears on the treatment I receive at his hands. And because you may believe me the better, I care not if I acquaint you with the circumstance. I was informed of late days that a certain blind retailer, called the diule, used to lend money upon pawns or any thing, and would let one have £1,000 upon a statute merchant of his soul. Or if a man plied him throughly, would trust him upon a bill of his hand, without any more circumstance. Besides he was noted for a priui benefactor to traders and parasites, and to adjuants fools and asses far sooner than any. To be a greedy pursuer of news, and so famous a politician in purchasing, that hell, which at the beginning was but an obscure village, is now become a huge city, wherever to all countries are tributary. These manifest conjectures of plenty, assembled in one commonplace of ability, I determined to claw avarice by the elbow, till his full belly gave me a full hand. And let him blood with my pen, if it might be, in the vein of liberality, and so, in short time, was this paper monster, Pierce Penniless, begotten. But written and all, here lies the question. Where shall I find this old assy that I may delire it? They say the lawyers have the diule and all, and it is like enough he is playing ambidexter amongst them. Pie. Fie. The diule a driver in Westminster Hall. It can never be. Now, I pray, what do you imagine him to be? Perhaps you think it is not possible for him to be so grave. Oh. Then you are in an error, for he is as formale as the best scrivener of them all. Marry, he doth not vse to wear a nightcap, for his homes will not let him, and yet I know 100, as well-headed as he, that will make a jolly shift with a court cap on their crowns, if the weather be cold. To proceed with my tale. To Westminster Hall I went, and made a search of inquiry, from the black gown to the buckram bag, if there were any such sergeant, bencher, counsellor, attorney, or pettifogger as Signor Cornuto Diabolo, with the good face. But they all, una voce, affirmed that he was not there, marry, whether he were at the exchange or no, amongst the rich merchants, that they could not tell. But it was the likelier of the two that I should meet with him, or hear of him in those quarters. Faith, and say you so, quoth I, and I'll bestow a little labour more, but I'll hunt him out. Without more circumstance thither came I. And thrusting myself amongst the confusion of languages, I asked whether he were there extant or no. But from one to another, non novite seminem, was all the answer I could get. At length, as fortune served, I lighted upon an old, straddling usurer, clad in a damask cassock. Of him I demanded if he could tell me any tidings of the party I sought for. By my troth, quoth he, stripling, and then he caught, I saw him not lately, nor know I certainly where he keeps J. But thus much I heard by a broker, a friend of mine, that hath had some dealings with him in his time. That he is at home sick of the gout, and will not be spoken withal under more than thou art able to jew, some 200 or 300 angels, if thou hast any sweet to him. And then perhaps hele strain courtesy with his legs in child bed, and come forth and talk with thee. But otherwise non est domi, he is busy with Mammon and the Prince of the Nortly, we to build up his kingdom, or sending his sprites abroad to undermine the maligners of his government. I, hearing of this cold comfort, took my leave of him very faintly, and like a careless malcontent, that knew not which way to turn, retired me to Paul's to seek my dinner with Duke Humphrey. But when I was there the old soldier was not up. He is long a-rising, thought I, but that's all one, for he that hath no money in his purse, must go dine with Sir John Best be trust, at the signa of the Chulka and Post. 2 hungry turns had I scarce fetched in this vast gallery, when I was encountered by a neat pedantical fellow in form of a citizen, who, thrusting himself abruptly into my company, began to question with me about the cause of my discontent. I discoursed to him the whole of my care. Why, quoth he, had I been privy to your purpose, I could have eased you of this trowel, for if it be the duel you seek for. No, I am his man. I pray, sir, how might I call you? A knight of the post, quoth he, for so I am Tirmed, a fellow that will swear you anything for 12 pence. But indeed I am a spyrite in nature and essence, that take upon this humane shape, only to set men together by the ears, and send souls by millions to hell. Now, trust me, a substantial trade, but when do you send next to your master? Why, every day, for there is not a cormorant that dies, or cutpurse that is hanged, but I dispatch letters by his soul to him, and to all my friends in the Low Countries. Wherefore, if you have anything that you would have transported, give it me, and I will see it delivered. Yes, marry have I a certain supplication here to your master, which you may peruse if it please you. With that he opened it and read as followeth. To the high and mighty Prince of Darkness, Doncel del Lucifer, King of Acheron, Styx and Phlegethon, Duke of Tartary, Marquess of Cocytus, and Lord High Agent of Limbo, his distressed orator. Pierce penniless, wisheth increase of damnation, and malediction eternal, per Jesum Christum du minum nostrum. Most humbly sueth unto your sinfulness, your single-souled orator, Pierce penniless. That whereas your impious excellence hath had the poor tenement of bis purse any time this half year for your dancing skoal, and he hath received no pennon or cross for farm. It may please your graceless majesty to give order to your servant Avarice he may be dispatched. Insomuch as no man here in London can have a dancing skoal without rent, and his wit and knavery cannot be maintained with nothing. Or, if this be not so plausible to your honourable infernalship, it might seem good to your hellhood to make extent upon the souls of a number of uncharitable cormorants, who having incurred the donger of a proimmunire with meddling with matters that properly concern your own person, deserve no longer to live, as men, amongst men, but to be incorporated in the society of divils. By which means the mighty controller of fortune and imperious subverter of destiny, delicious gold, the poor man's god, and idol of princes, might at length be restored to his powerful monarchic, and eftsoon be set at liberty. To help his friends that have need of him. Atheists triumph and rejoice, and talk as perplionly of the Bible, as Bias of Hampton. I hear say there be mathematicians abroad that will prove men before Adam. And they are harboured in high places, who will maintain it to the death that there are no die wells. It is a shame, Senior Beelzebub, that you should suffer yourself thus to be termed a bastard, or not approve to your predestinate children not only that they have a father, but that you are he that must own them. It is said, Lawrence Lucifer, that you went up and down London crying like a lantern in candle man. I Meruel no laundress would do the washing and starching of your face for your labour, for God knows it is as black as the Black Prince. It is suspected you have been a great tobacco taker in your youth, which causeth it to come so to passe, but Dame Nature, your nurse was partly in fault, else she might have remedied it. She should ha anointed your face ouer with lac virginis, which, baking upon it in bed till the morning, she might ha piled off the scale like the skin of a custard. And making a posset of vergis mixed with the oil of tartary and camphire, and bathed it in it 1/4 of an hour, and you had been as fair as the flour of the frying pan. I do not doubt, Dr. Diul, but you were present in the action of Philip of Spain, and helped to bore holes in ships to make them sink faster, and rents out galleyfoists with salt water, that stank like fuss-sea barrels with their master's fear. Is it your will and pleasure, noble Lancegrave of Limbo, to let us ha less carousing to your health in poison? Fewer underhand conspirings, or open quarrels executed only in wards. As if men will needs carouse, conspire, and quarrel, that they may make ruffians hall of hell, and their bandy balls of brimstone at one another's head, and not trouble our peaceable paradise with their private hurluburlies about strumpets. Where no weapon, as in Adam's paradise, should be named, but only the angel of Providence stand with a fiery sword at the gate to keep out our enemies. Be advertised, Master Os Sedidum, Bedel of Blacksmithies. That lawyers cannot do's which way in the world to beg, they are so troubled with brabblements and such Uri term, of yeomen and gentlemen that fall out for nothing. If John a Noakes his henny do but leap into Elizabeth de Gap's close, she will never low hunting her husband till he bring it to a Nisi Prius. One while the parson sueth the parishioner for bringing home his tithes, another while, the parishioner sueth the parson for not taking away his tithes in time. With 1 or 2 disjointed extracts I close the book. I pray ye, Timothy Tempter, be an arbitrator between these two, and couple them both by the necks and carry them to hell on your back. Clim of the cloth, thou that cess to drink nothing but scalding lead and sulphur in hell, thou art not so greedy of thy night gear. Oh! But thou hast a foule swallow of it come once to the carousing of humane blood. Some men there be that, building too much upon reason, persuade themselves that there are no die wells at all, but that this word demon is such another moral of mischief as the poet's Demiurgeon is of mishap. For as vender the fiction of this blind goddess we aim at the folly of princes and great men in disposing of honours, that oftentimes preferre fools and disgrace wise men, and alter their feigners in toning of an eye as fortune turns her wheel. So vender the person of this old grathonical companion called the Diul we shrowed all subtlety, masking vender the name of simplicity all painted hollands devouring widows' houses, all grey-headed foxes clad in sheep's garments. So that the Diul, as they make it, is only a pestilent humour in a man, of pleasure, profit or policy, that violently carries him away to vanity, villainy, or monstrous hypocrisy. I have long been sensible of a rapid decline. I feel growing chilly in my extremities. The freezing hand of death is moving near my heart. In this condition I not long since paid a visit to the northeast parts of Lancashire. The Lancashire lads and lassies are fond of a joke, and their jokes are not seldom somewhat rough and practical. As I wandered up and down, catching every now and then a sight of my emaciated form as reflected from this piece of water and that, I found myself somewhat pensive in the thought of my manifest decay. When proceeding from the river side up a gently ascending bank, I saw a signboard bearing the words, "The Del upon Done." "What have we here?" said I. "The sign is to me a mystery. I will enter and inquire what it means." Ordering refreshment by way of introduction, I asked my host, "What, sir, does your sign mean?" "Oh," he replied, "it's only a bit of a joke. The chap did the Oudon, dot." "Who's the Oudon?" "What, dinna ye know that? Where were ye born and bred?" "Why, the Oudon is the devil for sure." "And who's the chap?" "His name were Nicholas Gosford." "Will ye tell me the tale?" "I dinna mind." The landlord complied, and I take leave to put his Lancashire into ordinary English. The Del upon Done. Paddy Gosford was a tailor by trade, and in times gone by occupied the house there on the bridge. Nicholas was honest, for he cabbaged only a quarter of the cloth entrusted to him, and good-natured. But, like many of that sort, he liked a drop of drink. The money which should have supplied him and his family with the necessaries of life never could get past the door of this house, then called the Black Cat, so that Nicholas was for the most part miserably poor. One evening as he, with some of his pot companions, was in that chimney corner, a stranger was announced. He was bronzed by travel, and indeed he had seen much of the world, for many were the wonderful tales he told the villagers. In course of conversation he mentioned a young man of Lower Saxony who had gained immense riches through the devil, and he talked much of the incantations that had been used in the transaction of the business. The stranger's words appeared to strike Paddy greatly, for he dropped many mysterious hints about them afterwards. The next morning but one, taking advantage of his wife's absence at a neighbour's, he performed the magical operation. When forthwith the tempter stood before him with 2 attendant imps. With a terrific voice old Nick asked Nicholas what he wanted with him. "Nothing, nothing, sir," replied the tailor, shuddering from top to toe. "Nothing? What? Am I to come all the way from home to this petty place for nothing? You do not know, Mr. Snips, whom you have sent for, but I will let you feel that I am not to be trifled with." "Pardon me, great sir," exclaimed Paddy, falling on his knees. "Well, then, what do you want?" "I only thought you'd aid me a bit in the money way." "Well, what price will you pay?" "Price? I'm very poor, your reverence." "Your soul's your own." "Well, I thought so once, but I'm turned Catholic, and I fancy my soul belongs to them Whalley priests." "No jeering, Paddy, this is a serious matter. Now if you will sell me your soul, I will make you rich as you may wish." "It's a bargain, your honour." "Look ye, then, I will give yon power to get as mnch money as you like. Whatever you or your wife may wish for first after you meet, you shall have, on the express condition that you give me your soul 20 years after the bond is delivered to me signed with your own blood." "It's a bargain, your honour." 20 years I won't I have a jolly time of it." 20 years. 20 years. By and by Mrs. Gosford returned home. "What makes you so light-hearted, Paddy?" said she. "Faith and ye'll know in time, but certainly I'm hungry." "You shall have your tea." The tea was made ready and put on the table. "I don't like this bread, it's very dry. I wish I had a backstone of my own, Pad, wouldn't I make cakes you'd like?" A good backstone was forthwith put on the fire by an invisible hand. And hearing these words, Paddy, infuriated, exclaimed, "Woman, what did you say?" "I wish the backstone were broken into 1,000 pieces." Broken it was. Almost ere the wish was fairly out of his mouth. The wily husband then thought he had better tell the whole to his wife, as he had only one wish left. Mrs. Gosford, on hearing the matter, bade the reporter go and consult the prior of Whalley. "No, ye see, I'll not do that, they'd burn me for having to do with the devil, and it's better to go to hell in 20 years than at once." The next morning Paddy got up in an ill humour. He and his mistress had some words, for she did not like his dealings with Satan. Paddy lost his self-possession, and his memory therewith, and having to go to the hall that morning to measure Sir Humphrey, he suddenly said, I must shave. How I wish I had a can of hot water. A can was straightway placed on the table. That moment his recollection returned, and he exclaimed, "It's all over with the money, and, what's worse, it's all over with me." "No, no, Paddy," replied his thoughtful wife, "go and consult the hermit of Pendle, you know who once saved his life." After discharging his duty at the hall, Paddy hastened to consult the hermit, who said, "It is a bad case, Paddy, and you're a fool for your pains, but give up your drink and do your duty to your family. Then the church will stand by you, and all may yet be well." Time rolled rapidly on. Paddy, reformed in character, did well in business. His family also increased. But the fatal day came. The last hour of the 20 years found the hermit of Pendle and Paddy's wife on their knees in prayer in an inner room. While the husband, with his courage oozing out at his finger ends, waited in his shop, armed with a missal and holy water, the arrival of the foul fiend. He came, and, shewing Paddy the bond, curtly said, "Come with me." "Your worship." The terror-stricken man said, "Don't be hard with a poor fellow like me, remember you did not use me well in the matter of those wishes, not one of which did me any good. Well, as you're but a poor simpleton, I give you another wish. Turn it to account for the good of your family." The shop door was open, and that moment Paddy saw a horse grazing in a meadow a short distance from the house. "Thank your lordship 1,000 times for your goodness. I wish that you were riding on that horse back to the place from which you've come." The demon uttered a yell that was heard as far as Cone. The bond dropped from his hands. He leaped on the horse, and was carried away with the swiftness of the whirlwind. Having thus got rid of his troublesome creditor, Paddy, under the hermit's aid and direction, led a sober life, made a little money, took this inn, and put up the sign which drew your attention. The house flourished. For from all parts of Lancashire persons came to see the only man who had fairly outwitted the devil. The narrator of the story shook his sides heartily with laughing at what he called a capital trick. I confess his words had not relieved my melancholy. And so, I said to myself, it has come to this. I, who was first an archangel and then the prince of darkness, am now the object of sarcasm in village tap-rooms. My end is near. Little pleased with a spot where I had suffered so deep a humiliation, I winged my way to Rochdale. Why, I hardly know, except that change of locality was relief of mind. Arrived there, I went in the evening for a walk through its not very elegant streets. Coming to a bookstall, I stopped and ran my eye over its dingy treasures. It fell on an engraved portrait of Tim Bobbin. From certain symbols at the bottom of the picture, I found to be a quizzical son of the brush. I took the volume into my hand, and, running through its contents, came near the end on these words. To Mr. Robert Gordon in Salford, with the picture of the devil on horseback. Well, thought I, this looks very like Paddy's tale over again. Till read it. It ran thus. Milnrow, April 8, 1760. Sir, when I began to form the design of old Belsey on horseback, which you and your Newcastle friend ordered, I repented I had not inquired what sort of a devil you would have, i.e. whether you would have a black or a red devil, as white, green, yellow or blue, according to all authors, are out of the question, and also what color of a horse, and whether if he rid on a mare, it would not do as well. But these necessary queries being unfortunately neglected, I have been obliged to guess at the whole, and have now finished the piece, presuming you'll not be so ungenerous as to turn it on my hands. Because I believe it will suit no other person alive but your whimsical friend. If we can believe most authors, ancient and modern, clergy and laity, there are many legions of these awkward spirits, some of which go about and roar like lions. Yet, though there are such incredible numbers and yell so loud, you cannot imagine how I stood staring with the chalk in my hand, being quite nonplussed when I began to hunt for an idea, as having never seen the least glimpse of any one of them. But remembering that old Lucifer might be a child of some man's fancy in times of yore, I did not long hesitate, but thought I had as good authority as any other mortal to make a devil of my own. So I fell to it, and drew out my design, which pleased me tolerably well. But, alas! When I came to the coloring part, I was entirely gravelled, not knowing what color to make his galloper. Here I had thoughts of annihilating my whole design, and giving up all thoughts of proceeding, but suddenly recollecting that I had heard old folks talk of the devil upon done, I gave a jump, as thinking I had cleared the most knotty point. But, alas! Two circumstances soon quashed this sudden joy. One was, whether this done must be a horse or a mare, or a gelding, and the other, whether it must be a fat or a lean nag. But not remembering any author that had ever wrote on these abstruse points, I resolved to guess at them. And accordingly have not only made him a dun, but a sprightly, able, dun horse, because it is agreed on all sides that he goes with surprising expedition, especially when employed by court ladies in their gallantries, their husbands in amours, or ministers of state in all treaties which tend to faith-breaking, leaving their allies in a quagmire, or robbing, ruining or seizing their neighbors' territories, and so much for the horse. As for the devil, his jockey, of whom I hinted before that I could not tell whether to make him ride in red or black, I have taken a method to obviate all objections, and made him ride in both. In short, he has the horns of a Scotch bullock in his head, a dragon's tail, a negro's hands and face, a lady's scarlet capuchin on his head and shoulders, a rake's ruffles, a parson's coat, a beau's breeches, a tailor's giamashes, a jockey's whip, and a lawyer's saddle. So if this horse and this jockey will not please your fantastical friend, you may tell him when you write to him that I'll never pretend to paint a spirit again whilst I remain, as I hope I ever shall, sir, your most, and Tim Bobbin. This subtle raillery finished my resolution. In retiring from business, I must relieve my character of one stain thrown on it by Mr. Bobbin. I confess that I have worn the several liveries he has dressed me in. But for what he says as to treaty-mongers, no. I have never sunk so low as that. Not but I might have done, had I been tempted by certain great diplomatists of this my dying hour, who have lately been busy in robbing, ruining and seizing their neighbors' territories. But, in truth, they had no need of my aid, being fully equal of themselves to their atrocious plunderings and brutal devastations. The freedoms taken with me by the last-mentioned writer and artist are far surpassed by a devotee of the quill and the brush of very recent days. I have fallen into the hands of George Cruikshank and his sarcastic playfellows. By them I am stripped of my majesty, and held up as a laughing-stock to the world. I am, however, greatly indebted to them, for they write and paint in such a way as to throw my mortality into fullest and sharpest relief. Whoever peruses the Beale Devil's Walk, the Devil's Visit, Old Booty, and can no longer doubt that thousands and tens of thousands in the highest walks of life present my character and, in a measure, my form, with all its human failings and few of its human virtues, before the eyes of the world every passing day. Indeed, these my humanities, as I may term them, are so truly satanical in the bad sense of the word, that I have been smitten with the fear whether, after all, I can lay down my scepter to any good effect. So long as there are so many prepared to take it up and sway it perhaps more tyrannically than I have done myself. Chapter 9. Phases of my decline, Extrinsic and Intrinsic. This is the day of discrowned monarchs. As crowns when lost are of no value, I shall not waste my time in describing those that have been forfeited within the present century. Italy, Rome, Spain, France, Germany, have each and all seen that crowns and scepters have no stability except as expressions of the popular will. With arbitrary crowns, the divine right to do wrong is rapidly coming to an end. And if the divine right, then beyond a doubt the diabolic right is for the purpose of no value. In both cases the solid ground on which those prerogatives rested has been removed to so large an extent as to make it prudent to prepare for the worst. Intelligence, having achieved its emancipation, and in consequence become active and energetic, is on all sides busy in examining old foundations. In Protestant countries especially I have lost my hold on the people, who either quietly drop me into half-unconscious neglect, renounce me with scorn, or amuse themselves at my expense. Deprived of the suffrages of the people, I am no longer of service to the priests, and already foresee the period of universal contempt. That trial I have not courage to endure, even if I had any hope of success. But what is the use of a devil universally denied? Not that the case is yet so bad as this, but the worst must come, and I think it more decent to retire of my own accord, if only thereby to give effectual warning to all whom it may concern. One warning I have already given. I allude to a book published first as early as the year 1565. In the volume entitled Strategimata Satans, The Stratagems of Satan, by Jacobo Aconzio, both priests and people may find a program of ecclesiastical reform, the execution of which would have gone far to bring my reign to an end some 300 years ago. A contemporary of Luther's, Aconzio surpassed that great man both in principle and practice. Too liberal for Italy, he left his native land and found a fostering home under your English Queen Elizabeth. A greater honor she did not gain. Proceeding on the great and widely reaching principle, that every individual is answerable to God in religious matters. He gave bold and emphatic utterance to ideas which contain the germs of the ecclesiastical and religious reforms which have been effected since the age in which he lived, and which remain to be completed in coming years. So thoroughly is this statement true, that the reader of the book is involuntarily led to think of Jesus when, page after page, he meets with ideas equally strange to that period and equally true, lofty, comprehensive and benign. With characteristic consistency, the learned, liberal and truly Christian author carries the popular doctrine of satanic influence out to its full application. The ecclesiastics are not exempt from my influence, any more than other human beings. Indeed, they have vices peculiarly their own, and against these, in relation to themselves and to their disciples, he utters a voice of sober truth and earnest admonition. Indeed, he reproves and flogs vice as vice, sparing neither mitre, cowl or crown, and uttering denunciations the most severe on all, whether Catholic or Protestant, who point to heaven and lead the way to hell. Viewed in this light, the book is a scourge for the priests even more than for the laity. The rights and liberties of the latter, indeed, he specially espouses and defends, never seeming more at home than when he sets forth the great, positive and ever-enduring principles and doctrines which constitute the religion of Jesus in contradistinction to the religion of the churches. The entire volume, filled with the genuine spirit of prophecy, is a voice of warning, after the manner of the following, which is translated from its termination. Woe to you who, bent solely on your own fame and dignity and the good opinion of the vulgar, in order to obtain the position of gods on earth, despise, afflict and oppress your brother men, and usurp dominion over their consciences, thus surrounding their cities with Satan's power, and building strongholds on its behalf. Woe, I say, to you, woe, woe! What fearful punishment awaits you in the great day of retribution! Nor do I say this to the high priests of Rome alone, the cardinals and men of that sort, for what else would it be than to lose my labor? To them also I say it who, I hope, have still ears to hear, who, while professing to love Christ, are assailed by Satan with such subtlety as to fancy they have no need of offering him opposition. Let each of them be on his guard. Rome is not the sole birthplace of the Pope, he derives his origin from our parents. Not one of us but carries a Pope in his own breast, sure to shew his face and power on the first opportunity, unless the pontiff opposes the design and contrives to extricate himself from the peril. Woe to the miserable man who tells of the great number of the damned, yet forgets how much he has contributed to their destruction, it may be in ignorance, it may be, woe to him. After due admonition. How, I ask, can such an one endure the terrible majesty of the Lord's eye, when he stands before his judgment bar? What then will be his thought? His feeling? His fear? Bid adieu, then, my brethren, to ambition, to pretension, to anger, to animosity, to strife, to discord. Let Christ be the end of all our desires and endeavors, Christ and the glory of his name. Let us shake off that mortal torpor by which we are blinded against the snares that are set against us. Nor let any one take credit for being already in harbor, while others, still at sea, need precautions. I repeat what I said but now, that whoever reasons thus with himself is either close upon a pitfall or actually in one. For whose speech is this but that of Satan, who persuades men that they are most safe when they are in the greatest peril, and promises peace when he means war? Take care of thyself, my brother. Consider who thy assailant is. The more thou seemest to gain power over him, the more be thou on thy guard. The greater thy confidence, the greater must thy lowliness be, and the more earnest thy prayer to God that he would shew thee the snares which beset thy path. Thy path, I say, for each of us has his own. These perils thou must concern thyself with, not those which lie in thy neighbor's way. The need of prayer is greater even than the need of faith. The advice was disregarded, and by none more than the ecclesiastics. In consequence, what woes have afflicted the world since those ties and heroic words were uttered? Nevertheless, they were not spoken in vain. A great change has come over society. Every passing year that movement becomes wider, deeper, more powerful. It is gradually undermining old foundations, and none more than my throne. I have in my own mind gone over the principal causes which have conduced to bring matters to this pass, and I will here mention some of them, if only to prepare you for parting company with me. Ere I apply to the task, let me express a hope that my connection with you, dear young friend, has not been altogether unprofitable or unpleasant. It is perhaps one of the most promising features of the day that the clericals are taking to popular education. And if they really find pleasure in companying with the young, may I not consider the communications I have made to you as likely to be of service to the rising generation? Independently of that great social and religious cataclysm effected by the giant arm of Luther, and which in its main bearings was but a consequence of the extravagant power forced into my hands by the priesthood, and the unbounded tyrannical and cruel purposes to which it was turned for the suppression of thought and the aggrandizement of a caste, the restoration of the Bible to the haunts of men, breathing the warm and kindling breath of God, and so quickening men's hearts and consciences with a practical and earnest sense of both the supreme prerogative of personal responsibility and of the supreme duty of personal inquiry, has produced throughout the world a fermentation of mind, which, being favorable only to the real, the true, the divine and the everlasting, has for 3 centuries been undermining all decayed and rotten bases, nor less establishing on their own native rock the great verities which serve man by owning and revering God and Christ. This one cause alone would have ensured my downfall. Heaven and earth may pass away, but my words will not pass away, is the declaration of him before whose advancing footsteps I have been secretly receding for now nearly 2,000 years. The Bible has begotten not only religious liberty, but also religious spirituality. It has gone far to bring back the simple, devout, loving and beneficent religion of Jesus himself. The reign of the Son betokens the empire of the Father. And in a universe created and governed by the former and newly created by the latter, there is no place for me, and as little for the priest. The momentum of these 2 mighty powers has been augmented by the introduction of the press, 1423, which is the great light-bearer in the new heavens and the new earth, which are now coming forth with the rapidity, richness and beauty of an oriental spring all over the surface of the globe. The operation of these 3 capital agents secures and guarantees a new order of civilization, which will leave shams, shows and shadows of all kinds behind. Then consider how the earth itself has been laid open from pole to pole and from equinox to equinox. The widening of the area of man's vision is the widening of his mental horizon. Where now are those deserts, marshes and gulfs in which of old I was supposed to have my home? Men have gone over almost every acre of God's earth, and found not me, any more than they have found the fabled Presbyter John, or the unhappy, wandering Jew. Equally have astronomers disclosed the starry world. Have they discovered my dwelling place? Have they come upon any traces of my footsteps? If even a shellfish of the old world has left in stone an imprint of itself, surely so stupendous a potentate as I was did not traverse earth and skies without marking my devastating presence with my cloven feet somewhere. But hell is said to be beneath. What is beneath, as contradistinguished from above, in a universe where to you on this globe beneath and above change places every 24 hours and so astronomy even confutes my existence as a personal demon? By shewing that there is no radical and inherent difference between ascent and descent, and that consequently that my going down into hell was and remains a mere figure of speech, derived from the ignorance of the Dark Ages. Yes, clearly here, again, we have to do with men's passing conceptions, rather than God's everlasting realities. The geologists, however, in the common sense of the phrase, have gone down into the depths of the earth. Have they come upon me or my abode? It would be at least as correct to say that the hand that formed this globe has solidified its entrails and thrown them up into this light of day that they may be so seen and studied by human eyes as to reveal to human minds its whole interior. Which accordingly is in all its parts as familiar to science as is a mother's nursery to herself. Have the geologists come upon me or mine anywhere? While these great disintegrating influences have been actively at work for some 3 centuries, recasting the mind of man and reforming civilized society, certain great currents of mental and moral force have removed the scales from his eyes, and given him glad sight of the glorious universe of reality that God has unfolded in his instructive panorama which unrolls day after day and night after night before all intelligent eyes. Under the beneficent leadership of Bacon, science, that is accurate and systematized knowledge, has been carefully and successfully studied. In a certain sense it may be said that science, considered in its method, is a creation of the last 2 or 3 centuries. Now science, thus understood, means not only free and thorough research, but also full satisfaction of mind arising from sufficient evidence. This one position has put a crowd of fancies and shadows to flight. Resuming the study of every department of knowledge and belief, science has brought them all to the bar of cultivated intelligence, and, making them give an exact and full account of themselves, has convicted nearly all the old notions as more or less untrue. To this bar real science brought all the pretended sciences of past ages, and condemned them one after another. As a part of its duty, it took cognizance of me, and I must fairly confess that I was proved to be as a person an unreality. This proof is none the less effectual because informal, for in truth I have stood before the mind of every intelligent man in Europe, and been silently but emphatically condemned. The spirit of science and the spirit of demonology are so antagonistic, that where the one is, the other cannot be. Mental science has been specially busy within the last 100 years. The mind of man has been subject again and again to the most searching and minute analysis. Has it in its researches been led to me not the faintest trace has it met with of my presence. The mind of man is a unit, strictly and properly a unit. Having various qualities and aptitudes, it has one center and is of one tissue, so as to be ever the same thinking organism, how different soever its manifestations. The same may be said of man's moral nature. Here at least you ought to find traces of the fall and of my ceaseless operation. But man's moral nature science pronounces not a ruin, nor a battleground between 2 or more extraneous powers, but one harmonious whole. The unity of man's moral nature, as it is a datum of moral philosophy, so is it its fundamental axiom. The science of religion does indeed find me everywhere and at all previous times. But in what shape? A person? No. A personal devil it finds nowhere. The name it finds, as it finds the name of witch and gorgon. But the origin of all 3 it traces back equally into the remotest and thickest shades of antiquity, and the actual effacement of the 2 latter guarantees the effacement of the former. The ghosts, indeed, have hardly yet taken their final farewell even of England, but they linger only to bear me company in my approaching departure. Meanwhile, everyday men are more and more enjoying the consciousness of their emancipation. Delivered from a brood of at least distracting and annoying falsities, they feel themselves each his own master, and as such no less able than willing to work out each his own destiny. In making the most of the fine endowments and opportunities he has received from the wise and bountiful hand of the common ether. That generous and ennobling sentiment, no longer disturbed and darkened by the factitious distinctions of narrow theologies, makes every man the brother of every other and his co-heir of immortality. Hence the race of man is one family, the earth is the one great university, and heaven the one final home. Not least in consequence is the liberation that ensues from sacerdotal dictation as well as diabolical seduction and control. What ensues? The glorious liberty of the sons of God. Man stands alone in the presence of his Maker, the child in the presence of his Father. As there is no wrath on God's side, so there needs no vicarious pacification on the side of man. The Father leans toward his Son, the Son yearns toward the Father. True religion is born, and the birth of true religion unites the two. Religion now is a reality, and being a reality it is a power. Here is newness of life, and here is joy unspeakable and full of glory. The morality of the religion of Jesus owes its value and its efficacy to its own intrinsic qualities. Founded in the will of God, recognized by the individual conscience, sanctioned by its adaptedness to human nature as well as its congruity with the universe, enforced by its appeals to the heart and corroborated by every man's personal experience. Its ethics need no external legislation for their support, and no adventitious rewards or punishments for their acceptance and observance. And yet there are priests of the sanctuary who hold that Christian duty has no valid claim and no certain tenure except as accompanied by outward threatenings and superadded promises. The following are the words of Mons. I, Abbé Lecanou, of whose high authority in the Church of Rome I have already made use in my narrative. In the absence of heaven and hell, there is no reason for being virtuous. There is not even a place for saints. Instead of pursuing righteousness, it is far better to follow your inclinations. He would be a fool who should deprive himself of any pleasure, since there is no longer a reward for voluntary privation, or punishment for culpable enjoyment. This dictum measures the degradation into which morality has sunk under the extravagant use made by the writer and his co-workers of adventitious sanctions to virtue. That there should be no place for saints of this kind under a system of independent morality may well be believed, but then this is precisely its recommendation. Here, however, I have brought you face to face with the theoretical and practical ethics of Romanized Christendom. Its motto is, no reward, no virtue, no punishment, no vice. Consequently, if I lose my personality and hell ceases to burn, the morality of the universe is at an end. Such doctrines I brand as grossly and fearfully immoral. There is a moral order of the universe, and that moral order accomplishes its mission, under the finger of God, by intrinsic penalties and rewards. The divinely appointed consequences of man's actions assert and maintain their inviolability. Every truly religious thought carries in it the seeds of its own harvest. Every vice is a scourge which flogs the vicious. The vanishment of sacerdotal terrors and adventitious sanctions only leaves God's moral machinery to work unimpeded, and therefore to accomplish its wise and beneficent ends with ease and full effect. When I sink into kindred nothingness, God will shine forth only the more fully, the more refulgently, and the more effectually. Be at your ease, my gentle companion, the death of Satan is not the death of moral retribution. That can no more perish than the pillars that sustain the throne of God. God alone is quite sufficient for the government of the universe which he brought into being and constantly sustains. Equally manifest then as now will be the enormity of sin. Rather I should have said, far more manifest will it be. At present its intrinsic enormity is darkened, distorted and weakened by fabulous intermixtures. One of the most important duties of the present hour is to detheologize religion and morality. This will ensue when a personal devil is no more, then will it ensue, but never before. Then, too, will mutual moral responsibility be felt in all its clearness and force. Mortals do lead each other into sin. The sin of the individual becomes the sin, first of a family, and then of a neighborhood, and then of a country. There is in these facts a fearful account to give and a large repayment to make. But men's sense of their liability is dulled and destroyed by my intervention under the hands of sacerdotal teachers of morals. Where there are two backs to bear one load, the load has a fair chance of not being borne at all. Let each man bear his own burden, says the wise apostle, Gal. 6:5. And man's own individual and relative burdens are numerous enough and heavy enough to need no increase from satanical suggestions and impulses. And here I must put before you one consideration which makes me totally hopeless in regard to my future. My assumed personal existence is thoroughly immoral in its tendency. Not only does it complicate all moral questions whatever, tending even to the equity of God in his dealings with man, but it weakens and tends to nullify man's moral sense. On one side, man must feel himself overmatched when, in addition to his own deep sinfulness, he is beset constantly by a fiend who is at least next to Almighty, and whose rule depends on his success in misleading and corrupting human beings. On another side, he is relieved from his sense of personal responsibility by having another and a transcendently powerful being on whom, as the real author of sin in general and of his own sin, the individual is justified in casting no less the guilt of sin than the act. The notion, indeed, of vicarious demerit may have been possible as long as the corresponding notion of vicarious merit remained in vigor. But in the degree in which the great principle of the religion of Jesus, namely, individual responsibility, comes into prominence and finds acceptance, the falsities of satanical deprivation and messianic expiation become equally untenable and impossible. Nor when, in view of the numerous and horrible evils to which these pages bear witness as results of my supposed agency in God's providential government of the universe, you contemplate the human and divine reality, viz. that of a world pervaded, guided and blessed by the wisdom, goodness and power of the one infinite Father, can any lower feeling arise than an overruling desire to obey the Almighty? If only from the admiring and worshipping love with which the soul is flooded in the contemplation of the disappearance of all spots from the face of the central sun, and of the sole and exclusive prevalence of the pure and serene luster of such goodness in absolute perfection as radiated from the life of the Son of Man during his public ministry on earth. That all-pervading brilliancy will totally eclipse me, a blotch on the face of creation, cast there by human hands, if only because, while the influence of me as an incarnation of evil is most demoralizing, the Spirit of God in Christ quickens human souls with all pure thoughts, all chaste desires, all holy aspirations, raising them into that higher sphere whither temptation cannot come, and whence in consequence all moral evil is forever banished. The process of decomposition thus effectually working in Great Britain, as well as in other Protestant lands, especially the United States of America, in connection with religion, was repeated on philosophical grounds and with all the rigor of the most cultivated dialectics in the schools of France and Germany, where it has produced results which either quietly ignore me as a phantom of the past, or assail my existence with the two-edged sword of reason and religion, the keenness of whose edge and the temper of whose steel I have too often felt, not to shrink from tempting it any longer. The power of this adverse direction lies not so much in anything as to my origin and existence, as in the production of a freedom of thought and a lustration of mind which involve principles and sentiments with which the recognition of me, as a personal embodiment of evil, is utterly incompatible. Had not one dart been discharged against me by the hand of avowed assailants, I must have perished, as perish I shall, from the general tendencies of thought and effort which may be termed the spirit of the age. As much as the 13th century was Satan's day, so much is this the day of the children of light. And I may hint at one or two phases of this period which exercised an unusual influence in sapping my foundations. When Descartes, 1596 to 1650, laid the basis of his system of philosophy not so much in general doubt as in absolute denial, casting out of his mind, so far as he could, all its contents in order that honestly, thoroughly and safely he might build his intellectual house afresh, he recognized and recommended a principle whose observance was destined to be my ruin. Originated by speculation and supported on fable and authority, I received my death blow the very day when these were set at naught, and a philosophic individualism was established in their place. So long and so far as that individualism, however, dealt with vague intellectual speculations, I found myself in an atmosphere in which it was possible for me to sustain a temporary existence. But when Kant, 1724 to 1804, had shattered all these entities and quiddities, and made moral truth the source, essence and pabulum of existence, then I found myself totally shut out of the universities by the conjectural nature of all belonging to me, and specially by the evil dispositions I was said to cherish. And here, even at the risk of being misunderstood, I must place foremost some names who are of ill repute with rigid conservatives of all kinds. The English deists of the last century did an important work, if only blighting the poisonous blossoms and withering the deadly fruit that they found on that tree of life which was intended to be for the healing of the nations, but which, alas, had been grafted with apples of Sodom. Then came the great French scoffer, and did his utmost to crush what he called l'infame, that is, the superstition of the priests. If he has in his composition too much of my bad side to deserve unqualified approbation, even I cannot deny that he rendered a high service to his race in his heroic defense of the persecuted Gallas family. In such a way as to command the admiration of Europe, and to give the last blow to that compound of atrocities, the Papal Inquisition. The day that the Protestant John Gallas was broken on the wheel in Toulouse, March 10, 1762, for what Yaltair proved to be the imaginary crime of murdering his eldest son in order to prevent his becoming Catholic, that day, owing to the noble and persistent efforts of the philosopher of Ferney, saw the rise in Europe and the world of the sun of religious liberty, nor less of religious earnestness and simplicity. Could I tarry to describe the scene and its actors, you would be disposed to say that in one of my worst moods I had transferred my slaughterhouse for the occasion to the city of Toulouse. About the time when this dreadful crime was committed, reverberations of which passed over Europe, and everywhere stirred the hearts of righteous men with indignation. A great ordinal change was on the point of emerging in that old stern stronghold of civil and religious liberty which bears the name of England. William III, Prince of Orange, ascended the throne in that land in 1688. Most auspicious event. Then Nonconformity undertook to relax the bonds in which the mind of the nation lay cramped, though not subdued, and its three chief denominations, the Presbyterians, the Independents and the Baptists, began that fight which, either together or separately, they have kept up to the present hour, and which has eventually issued in freedom of speech and freedom of act. Leaving only one thing to be desired, namely, complete equality of all forms of religion in the eye of the legislature and in the intercourses of private life. This atmosphere is too attenuated, pure and ethereal for me to breathe in long. Either it must be altered or I must depart. The first of these three religious bodies received of the paither of lights a signal advantage. From being the strictest of the three in respect of religious freedom, it became the most liberal. Its liberality encouraged examination and research, and these led to the conviction that the central dogmas of Protestant orthodoxy were unsound. Among the condemned points of popular belief was my personality, which was openly disowned and combated among these people long before it was even doubted in the other denominations, with whom indeed it, for the most part, retains a weakened hold even to this hour. Here shine forth the names of Newton, Locke, Lardner, Taylor, Priestley, Price, and of many other lights of the world. The great service rendered by these champions of a free and simple gospel lies in their liberation of the morality of Christianity from all sacerdotal accretions. This they effected to such an extent as almost to identify religion and morality. If in going so far they at all lessened the religious element and almost abolished the theological, the mistake may be excused in consideration of the fact that morality was almost sunk in ecclesiasticism throughout the Church. A morality that could assert its own rights and enforce its own claims was all but totally unknown in modern Europe until the English deists began to exercise their influence in England and Lessing published his invaluable works in Germany. Then a new era dawned, and the degree in which its sun ascends toward the zenith is the degree of my decline. The older German theologians retained more or less fully and firmly the ideas entertained by Luther, and which generally bear the name of orthodox, but philosophy and the spirit of the age gradually dissolved those views, so that the moderns, e.g. Morris, Bernhard, Storr, Knapp, Kaiser, Stuttel, united with Michaelis and Doderlein to doubt the common opinions, or, like Schott, Eckermann, Heinke, Wegscheider, Jan Ammon, de Wet, Hayes, Baumgarten Crusius, Bretschneider and others. Set them aside as notions of the day which did not belong to Christianity. While others, under the influence of Kant, conceived of Satan as simply the ideal of wickedness, and so concurred in the view of myself which I have given throughout this memoir. A still more distinguished authority, one who may be called the originator and master of the modern spiritualism of the Protestant Church, Schleiermacher, constructing Christianity out of the Christian conscience, and finding no devil there, pronounces me a superfetation, and as such so ridiculous as not to be imputable to the belief of any one. Belief in Satan forms no part of religion, and of his influence in consequence nothing can be said. The first lance thrust into my side was handled by an Englishman, who in the person of Eginald Scott resolutely denied that I could change the laws of nature. Bekker of Amsterdam, plus as already set forth, went a step farther. Placing himself on the ground of Cartesianism, he rejected all action of malign spirits on the sensible world, and maintained that demoniacal possessions are only imaginations or diseases of the mind. This opinion, put forward by medical men of the time of Origen, is now generally held by the thinking and cultivated public. English orthodoxy, both conformist and nonconformist, more conservative of error than curious after truth, does indeed continue to countenance me, at least in form and from the popular pulpits. But daily does the patronage in the higher and more scholarly levels grow, here subdued, there qualified, there timid, and there half ashamed of itself. So that, unless I of my own accord renounce my claims, I shall, I foresee, ere long be deserted by the theology as well as the intelligence of the English nation. This impending abandonment will doubtless be due to the combined influence of the causes to which I have referred. But one or two special ones deserve mention. The Unitarians of England and the United States have long denied my personal existence, and some of their best divines, Estlin, Simpson, Scott, J. Grundy, and one of their most effective missionaries, have in print assailed my scriptural claims. Moreover, the general tendency of their reasonable and spiritual direction of religious thought and effort, as seen in the writings of Parker and Martineau, being in favor of the final prevalence of the divine will, and consequently of human purity and happiness, has worked silently but effectually so as to threaten to issue in my final overthrow. Yet had the example of these excellent men been less sparingly followed in more recent days, fanaticism would be nearer its sepulchre than it is, not in England only, but in Scotland, where I have been all but worshipped, and where I am still held in a slavish respect of which I am myself ashamed. Another body of religionists must not be passed wholly in silence, since they, at least in their offspring in the United States, have contributed largely to the decline and fall of an empire more huge and more baneful than that of ancient Rome. I allude to the Universalists. They originated in the latter part of the last century in Great Britain in two centers. One was Trinitarian. Here the Universalists, holding to the doctrine of vicarious substitution, maintained that, since Christ died for all would share in the benefits of his death. Consequently Satan and hell were superfluities. Sin was a disease which would yield under the hand of God in death. Of persons holding these views, there were congregations in London, Salisbury, Portsmouth and Glasgow. The other branch of English Universalists were more or less intimately connected with the rationalistic tendency which sprang from English deism. Of these Mr. Vidler was an eloquent representative in the metropolis of England. The Universalists are now a large and influential body, especially in the United States. Among their principal authors are Elu and Chapin. The joint operation of these and similar influences has utterly changed men's view of the universe, and that not in its physical relations alone, but also, and emphatically, in its moral and religious. The universe is one. Its physical and its moral order are one severally and one in combination. This one universe has one source and one governor. Consequently one will produces, sustains, and guides the whole. That will is the will of the one universal ether. The period in which this sublime verity is coming into recognition may be appropriately called the rule of the ether. As such, it is the rule of the sun. What else is it, then, than the kingdom of God on earth? Here you see the triumph of the religion of Jesus. Here you witness the fulfillment of prophecy. Here you behold God's wise and benevolent purposes for his children of mankind, worked out and clearly presented, at least in outline. The outline is such as to expand into a full and august portrait, the portrait of the living God imprinted on the moral and spiritual creation. Seeing these sublime and enduring realities, you see so many tokens and premonitions of my decay. There is no place for me in a universe which is pervaded and blessed by the Spirit of the Universal Father. I have enumerated the principal causes of my decay as they have been in operation during some 300 years. These are mostly extraneous. They produce their effect by operating mainly on the exterior. But in truth, like everything mortal, I carry within me the seeds of my own dissolution. As a name rather than a being, I share in the corruptibility and decay of all forms of language whatever. The reflection of a daydream of some untutored Indian, I only took an outward shape when his descendants had acquired the difficult art of linguistical articulation. Thus becoming an echo of the human voice, I spread from individual to individual and from hut to hut, an aerial phantom which all feared and none could describe. By and by that sound acquired the solidity and exercised the functions of a proper name. Now, then, my existence assumed a certain superficial reality. Centuries passed away, and still I was nothing more concrete than an articulate sound. However, the time came when from audible signs I passed, on the discovery of writing, into some kind of visible form. Then first men called me and wrote me down as Satan. But here, too, there is a history, which I can explain only by using the corresponding English term. I was the adversary. Originally they had spoken of me as adverse, that is as evil. Opposition they found on every side, and opposition must, they felt, have its cause. I was that cause. But the assertion was at first particular, and became general only by degrees. Accordingly men said it, that which was opposite in any case to their wishes or their interests, it was bad. It took centuries to transmute this bad into many bads, and centuries more to condense all these into badness. Still, however, we have no personal sign. Who can say how long it took to enable the semi-barbarous races to speak of a bad one? Another slow process of growth gave birth to the bad one. Another, again, was requisite to put the sound into writing, as, the bad one. Here we have the components of the idea involved in, the adversary. But this adversary is only local. Untold ages must have passed before the bad one or the adversary of one tribe became the adversary of an island, a continent, a hemisphere, the earth. And so at last we are brought to the general conception of the adversary. Comparatively very late in the progress of culture must be the date of the origin of the personal designation, the adversary. And now, my valued amanuensis, consider of what elements this written sign consists. You, like most other ordinary persons, suppose that in the adversary or the Satan you have a concrete living and permanent individual. That, however, is a mere conception, a figment of your own plastic brain. Men create their own devil, and they create him out of the sounds which they have uttered and the visible signs they have invented. In reality, that which is denoted by the term the adversary, is, if looked at, merely a certain combination of visible lines and curves, and, if uttered, certain reverberations of the stricken air. And is Satan nothing more substantial than this? You ask. I reply, whatever else it is comes from your own prolific mind. The proof is, that, the adversary, if you go back through the process by which you saw it come into existence, can be reduced to its successive shapes, until at last it passes from a visible, audible and articulate something, into a notion. A fancy, a dream of your own, begotten of some piece of ill luck, some raging tempest, some serious disappointment, some fit of ill humor, some dark presage occasioned by annoyance, vexation, or even indigestion. It is himself that man throws outwardly in the visible and audible signs which are called written language. I am then in reality nothing more substantial than a projection of a certain state of man's mind. Were the projection an image of man's highest culture, it would be a reality. But in truth the projection is simply the deepest shade of man's unculture. In other words, it is a shadow of the hugest misconception man ever made, born of his ignorance, bred on his narrowness, nurtured in his lowest and fiercest passions, and brought to maturity long before truth and reality had dawned on the human race. As such, it is merely a projection of a state of the human mind which the race has outlived in all its higher representatives, and which now darkens and disturbs only the lowest and most depraved, that is the least human, circles of society. This concise history contains a prophecy of my speedy downfall. As other personifications have ceased to be viewed as persons, as the sun and the moon have passed from personal beings into mere organic matter, so am I, in my turn, destined to dissolve and vanish into the empty air out of which I received my personal existence from some human lip long ago reduced to dust. Sic transit gloria mundi. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning! How art thou cut down to the ground, who didst harass the nations! Is 14. 12. Were any doubt left as to that fall by the previous considerations, I proceed to mention one which removes the possibility of a question. I am the child of a dualistic conception of the universe, and can live no longer than it survives. Arising in a barbarous age, the notion of two great powers or principles as the sources of good and evil, light and darkness, happiness and woe, spread so as to cover the whole area of the mind and life of man. Hence arose subaltern dualisms, such as mind and matter, body and soul, spirit and flesh, heaven and hell, which, sharply sundered the one from the other, set the whole world, not in contrast only, but in collision. Down to a recent date, this universal dualism governed thought, directed metaphysical speculation, molded creeds, and shaped and colored the church. Accordingly, you had monarchs to rule and subjects to obey, priests to dictate and laymen to believe, soldiers to fight and civilians to pay the cost. The whole tendency of intellectual philosophy during at least a century has been adverse to this antagonism and favorable to a Unitarian view, as of God and the universe, so of human beings in all their relations. God and the universe are one in the sense that the former produces the latter, which he pervades and in which he is mirrored. In that universe is man, the least inadequate image of God. Man in himself is one being, endowed with various aptitudes, which differ but do not conflict, being all meant and all fitted to grow into concord, alike well-proportioned, beautiful and efficient. Sin, therefore, though baneful, as consisting in actual disobedience to the divine will, is overruled for good, and will in the end be made to serve the wise and benign purposes of the infinite Father. Meanwhile there is a counterworking of the animal and spiritual nature, but not such as to involve an internecine war. Moreover, mind is only the root of which matter is the fruit, and matter is the form of which mind is the substance. The body, too, is the soul in outer and visible manifestation. In the same way death is but the first step on to the higher life. For man under God is immortal, man consisting of a spirit allying him to his Maker, and a body connecting him with the phenomenal world. And as that world will ever coexist with the world of substance, so will men after death possess some aerial organism, Paul's spiritual body, by and through which spirits of all orders will intercommunicate. No longer then will the universe be a compound of antinomies, but rather a combination of harmonies. Heaven and hell, considered as places, will disappear. The kingdom or rule of God will have for its happy result the kingdom of heaven. The reign of the All-Father will be my exclusion from sovereignty. One God, the source, author, governor and benefactor of all things, leaves neither place nor function for the devil. It follows, that the full realization of the Hebrew monotheism is the realization of the highest good of the universe, and the highest good of the universe necessarily excludes evil in person, in principle, in manifestation and in practice. So much for what I may term the intellectual and historical aspect of this question. I pass to the ethical. Yes, there is something deeper still, something which, like a cankerworm, is eating out my vitals. Whatever I am, whether a person, a personification, a power, or a word, I am, according to universal opinion, bad, wicked, base. In this description of myself I shall carry the world at large with me. As such, I am rotten at the core. Either there is no God, or goodness alone is permanent and everlasting. Deny the averment, and you make wickedness eternal no less than goodness, and two eternals are two gods. But two gods in conflict means the rule of infinite confusion. What is that but boundless weakness and uncertainty? And so here, again, you are brought to practical atheism, or, what is the same thing, all-pervading chaos. But as evil, I totally lack the element of permanency. Hence one of the two contending parties is an unreality. Evil, as evil, must perish or be permanent. If permanent, it makes good insecure, and an insecure God is no God at all. Evil, then, is not permanent. If not permanent, it is perishable. And whatever is perishable must come to an end. Such is my fate. The result is merited. I cannot look back on my past without compunction. I have been the occasion to the human race of innumerable deceptions. Yet in extenuation I must plead that, after all, it is rather man who has flogged himself with his own chimeras. Unhappily, those who should have delivered him from the viperous brood have nourished and propagated it. However, at this my extremely advanced age, I am too oppressed with contrition, in view of the terrors and woes I have caused, to tolerate the feeling of reproving others. I leave them to their own reflections, as I am prompted by mine in thus making my confession and expressing my sorrow. I cannot, however, refrain from saying, that as I have been led by penitence to expose the terrible deceit which my name represents. I hope that all who have been my masters or my servants will join with me in doing their best to rid the world of the most deadly of its plagues. But I deny that I am solely evil. As a human offspring, I have my good qualities no less than my bad. The better side of my nature anticipates with serene satisfaction the sunderance and rejection of the inferior side. Anticipated death, then, has in reserve no alarm, no distress for me. On the contrary, I look forward with calm delight to the time when I shall be delivered from the body of this death, calm. 7:24. My deliverance will be at once cause and consequence of the deliverance of the human race. This bright prospect do you go forth and hold out to the nations. Men will be won by hope, while they are borne down and destroyed by fear. The reign of love in the Church will make the Church as universal as the sunbeam, and equally beneficent. But this attractive future is depicted by the great apostle more truly and more attractively than can be done by any words of mine. And therefore I ask you to study the following quotation from Paul's epistle to the Romans. As many as are led by the Spirit of God are the sons of God. And ye did not receive the spirit of bondage leading unto fear, but ye received the Spirit of adoption wherein ye cry, Abba, Father. The Spirit itself beareth witness to our spirit, that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs. Heirs of God, and joint heirs with Christ. Since we are suffering with him to the end, that we also may be glorified with him, for I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are of no account in comparison of the glory which is to be revealed in us. For the earnest expectation of the creation is waiting for the revelation of the sons of God, for the creation is made subject to vanity, not of its own will, but by reason of him who made it subject in hope. For the very creation itself shall be set free from the bondage of corruption into the liberty of the glory of the children of God, for we know that the whole creation groaneth and travelleth in pain together until now. And not only so, but even ourselves, having the first fruit of the Spirit, even we ourselves groan within ourselves, waiting for the end of the adoption, to wit, the redemption of our body. Moreover, we know that to them that love God all things work together for good. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor principalities, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor any other created thing, shall he able to separate us from the love of God, which is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Chapter 10. Testimonies. Mine has been a bold task. But for some noble members of your race it could not have been performed. In their writings I have found light, encouragement and courage. I will cite a few words. And I cite what follows with the greater satisfaction because, while it justifies the task I have performed and upholds the principles I have in part acted on, in part enforced, it relieves me from any charge of narrowness. Since the witnesses I adduce in my own cause are for the most part ministers of religion. Were they the priests whom I warn the world against, no word of theirs could have been adduced in favor of the great aims of the composition which, having reviewed its sheets more than once, I now, dear Theophilus, put into your hands for publication. Kepler. The two revealing books. The day will soon dawn when pious simplicity will be ashamed of its blind superstition, when men will acknowledge truth no less in the book of nature than in the sacred scriptures, and rejoice alike over both revelations. Spinoza. Harmony of right thinking and right acting. What is most consonant with reason is most conducive to virtue. Chillingworth. Reason is the judge. For my own part, I am certain that God hath given us our reason to discern between truth and falsehood, and he that makes not this use of it, but believes things he knows not why, I say it is by chance that he believes the truth, and not by choice. And I cannot but fear that God will not accept this sacrifice of fools. Religion of Protestants, page 133. Bishop Jeremy Taylor. Son is the judge. That is, we being the persons that are to be persuaded, we must see that we be persuaded reasonably. Liberty of Prophesying, 1687, page 507. Bishop Gibson. It is universally acknowledged that revelation itself is to stand or fall by the test of reason. Or, in other words, according as reason finds the evidences of its coming from God to be or not to be sufficient and conclusive. And the matter of it to contradict or not contradict the natural notions which reason gives us of the being and attributes of God. Second Pastoral Letter, 1730. Dean Prideaux. Let what is written in all the books of the New Testament be tried by that which is the touchstone of all religions, I mean that religion of nature and reason which God has written in the hearts of every one of us from the first creation. And if it varies from it in any particular, if it prescribes any one thing which may in the minutest circumstances thereof be contrary to its righteousness, I will then acknowledge this to be an argument against us, strong enough to overthrow the whole cause, and make all things else that can be said for it totally ineffectual for its support. Letter to the Deists, 1748. Archbishop Tillotson. All our reasonings about revelation are necessarily gathered by our natural notions about religion, and therefore he who sincerely desires to do the will of God is not apt to be imposed on by vain pretenses of divine revelation. But if any doctrine be proposed to him which is pretended to come from God, he measures it by those sure and steady notions which he has of the divine nature and perfections. He will consider the nature and tendency of it, or whether it be a doctrine according to godliness, such as is agreeable to the divine nature and perfections, and tends to make us like unto God. If it be not, though an angel should bring it, he would not receive it. Sermons, 3. Page 485. Dr. Conyers Middleton. The Fall of Man, a Moral Fable. From the authority of many of the ancient interpreters and from my own reflections, I have ever been inclined to consider the particular story of the fall of man as a moral fable or allegory, such as we frequently meet with in other parts of the Old and New Testament, in which certain religious duties and doctrines, with the genuine nature and effects of them, are represented, as it were, to our senses by a fiction of persons and facts which had no real existence. And I am the more readily induced to espouse this sense of it, from a persuasion that it is not only the most probable and rational, but the most useful also, by clearing it of those difficulties which are apt to shock and make us stumble, as it were, at the very threshold. Works, 2. 131. Archdeacon Paley. To remove what contradicts man's intelligence is a service to Christianity. Whoever can render religion more rational, renders it more credible. He who by a diligent and faithful examination of the original records, dismisses from his system one article which contradicts the apprehension, the experience, or the reason of mankind, does more towards recommending the belief, and, with the belief, the influence of Christianity, to the understanding and consciences of serious inquirers, and through them to universal reception, than can be effected by 1,000 contenders for creeds and ordinances of human appointment. Moral Philosophy, Dedication to Bishop Law. Dr. Priestley. The gross darkness of that night which has for many centuries obscured our holy religion, we may clearly see, is past, the morning is opening upon us. And we cannot doubt but that the light will increase and extend itself more and more unto the perfect day. Happy are they who contribute to diffuse the pure light of the everlasting gospel. The time is coming when the detection of one error or prejudice relating to this most important subject, and the success we have in opening and enlarging the minds of men with respect to it, will be far more honorable than any discovery we can make in other branches of knowledge, or our success in propagating them. Corruptions of Christianity, Dedication. Lessing. The love of God is true freedom and true power. Intelligent love of God, the common spirit of the world, will make men free. The time of a new and everlasting gospel will certainly come. Enough that I already see in the toys of children the weapons which men will one day wield with a firm hand. Free inquiry. Enter upon this inquiry like an honest man, I say to myself. See everywhere with thine own eyes. Pervert nothing, palliate nothing. As the consequences flow, so let them flow. Neither check the stream nor divert it. The decrial of reason from the pulpit. The author shews that to denounce the noblest human faculty, reason, as a weak, corrupt, blind, seductive guide, is as little in accordance with the spirit and teachings of Christ. As the favorite recurrence to the fall of Adam and Eve, and the universal depravity therefrom, brought forward for the purpose of fostering a blind faith, corresponds to biblical records and traditions. To the theological pulpit authorities who decry reason he calls out, you make yourselves ridiculous by contradicting your own deeds, for you continue to calumniate that very reason which you are unable to dispense with in your demonstrations and refutations. You grudge to others the use of that which you apply for yourselves at every moment, and in this respect are not a whit better than the Catholic priests whom you so severely denounce, because they deny to the laity the reading of the Bible, which they prefer to keep to themselves and interpret according to their own pleasure. Belsham. From Genesis to Malachi I see no account of any such malignant being as the devil is commonly imagined to be. All good and all evil is in the Jewish scriptures ascribed to the one God, who is the great and primary agent in all events. It is Jehovah, and not the devil, that hardens the heart of Pharaoh, Exodus 7. 3. And if there is evil in the city, it is the Lord, and not an evil spirit, who hath done it. The word devil never occurs in the Old Testament in the sense in which it is now used. And Satan properly signifies only an adversary. In the New Testament the word devil is sometimes used to personify the principle of evil, and sometimes the idolatrous and persecuting power. And the want of attention to this figurative mode of expression has misled many readers who were ignorant of Hebrew and Oriental phraseology, and has induced them to believe the real existence of an evil spirit. The possessing demons were not fallen angels, but human ghosts. And who can believe that human ghosts are permitted to enter into the bodies of living men and to torment them? One who can suppose that a man cannot fall into an epileptic fit without being struck down by a ghost, or that a lunatic cannot utter blasphemies in his raving paroxysm without being instigated by a ghost. The Isu Testament invariably distinguishes between the devil and demons, that is ghosts, and never speaks of a person being possessed by devils, but uniformly by ghosts. Herder. Satan the king of shadows. By Sheol or hell the Hebrews meant nothing more than the permanent residence of the dead. The inhabitants of this abode were regarded as still possessing a kind of life even in the grave. On this account they called the grave the house of rest, the mansion of unbroken peace. The soul thus considered as a shade they placed in subterranean dwellings. There were found the ancestors of the Hebrews. Shadowy kings sat on shadowy thrones. Nay, whole cities, kingdoms, and vanquished armies, were crowded together in this mansion of shadows. Thus in process of time the subterraneous kingdom obtained a monarch, whose name was Belial, the ghostly king of imaginary beings, without substance or power. Then Sheol became a palace, an impregnable fortress with gates and bars of brass. It was a devouring gulf which never restored anything it had swallowed. Even in the New Testament we find many expressions which bear the marks of this mythology, as in the king who had the keys of hell and death, Rev. I. 18, who opened gates which none but he could open, subdued potentates, and delivered souls, which he alone could deliver. It would be a very improper manner of illustrating things to apply all this to our ideas of hell and death. It is nevertheless certain that this kind of misapplication has taken place with respect to many ideas and modes of speaking which ought to be confined to the particular times in which they were employed. In the meantime the idea of hero or governor, considered in the extensive signification of those terms in the ancient poetry, came to denote great things, awful power and dominion. The potentate who reigned over human souls and had the power of death became an unrighteous tyrant, and the anointed of the Lord wrested from him both his dominion and his prey. Thus during the space of 5,000 years the human race, destitute of any defense or support against this ibex of shadows, were in a long state of servitude and terror, or, to use the language of a sacred writer, were, through the fear of death, all their lifetime subject to bondage. Hence the doleful lamentations of Hezekiah. Hence that dejection which prevailed among the Hebrews at the prospect and approach of death, which the chieftains and people of other nations beheld and resisted with magnanimity and valor. In this respect the Hebrews were, if I mistake not, the most dastardly people upon earth. The dismal ideas of the shadow kingdom tormented them perhaps still more than the belief of a total annihilation would have done. Religion endures nothing magical. As the pagan temples lie in ruins on the spot where they once stood in pride, so will all altars be broken down on which worship is offered to a false god. This is the decree of the irrevocable law of the Supreme Father, the advance of human intelligence, the spirit of Christianity, and the great tendencies of creation. Nature can endure nothing unnatural, truth nothing untrue, religion nothing magical. A long night has covered everything, but the sun is rising and the spectres are taking to flight. Dr. Lardkser. It having been in those times, the age of Jesus, a very common opinion that there were very many evil spirits in the region of the air, it is not at all strange that many people should live under apprehensions of suffering from them. And many might be induced to ascribe to such spirits and to their power and influence several indispositions and other calamities that befell them. Moreover, some persons of a speculative and philosophical temper might think it best to cherish this opinion among the people, with a view to subserve divers ends and purposes which they deemed innocent and useful. One of which might be promoting the belief of the existence of spirits or invisible beings. Some there were, as the Sadducees among the Jews, who denied the existence of angels and the souls of men after death. The Pharisees, therefore, and some others might lay hold of and encourage the notion, that many bodily disorders were owing to evil spirits, the better to secure the persuasion of their real existence. This, therefore, may help us to account for the prevalence of this opinion, though it had no good foundation. It is not unreasonable to hold that the notion of possessions was received by the Jews from the Chaldean or Greek philosophers. It does not appear that the common opinion of possessions has any countenance in the Old Testament. Possession by evil spirits is a thing in itself absurd and impossible. At the least unreasonable and improbable, and not to be supposed unless there be clear and full proof, which I think there is not. Real possessions seem inconsistent with the goodness of God. For let any man think with himself, if it be not a strange and hard case for a man to be put into the power of evil spirits, or for apostate angels, or other impure and wicked spirits, one or more of them, to be allowed to take possession of him, and to tease and torment him as they think fit. Can we fairly reconcile this to the wisdom and equity of the divine government? All those persons who are spoken of as having demons, or an unclean spirit, had some bodily indisposition. Does it appear clearly from their history that there was anything besides such indispositions, and that discomposure of mind which usually accompanies them? There were eminent persons in ancient times who were of opinion that those called demoniacs were diseased only. This has been the opinion of some judicious, thoughtful and pious men of late times. This opinion is confirmed by Scripture, which describes Jesus as healing these very persons, who went about doing good and healing all that were oppressed of the devil, Acts 38, Comp. Mat. 4. 24. It is no uncommon thing for opinions to prevail in the world which have no solid foundation. How many have been disposed to ascribe the diseases of the human body, and other disastrous events in the world, to the planets or other stars? Lardner's Works, Yall. I. 449, Seek. London, Dowding. Professor Niender. Diseases of the mind in every age bear the stamp, to some degree, of the prevailing tendencies and ideas of the times. And those of the demoniacs reflected the peculiar and predominant features of the Jewish mind of that age. The wretched beings seemed to be hurried onward by a strange and hostile power that subjugated their intellectual and moral being, and whose chief characteristic, as displayed in their paroxysms, was a wild and savage destructiveness. The Jews explained these phenomena according to their own notions, and especially by the general opinion that man was surrounded on every side by the operations of evil spirits, who were the authors of both moral and physical evil. And as a fierce destructiveness was considered to be characteristic of these spirits, the condition of the demoniacs was ascribed to their being possessed by one or more of them. The diseased persons themselves involuntarily conceived of their own experience according to the prevalent opinion, and their expressions, literally taken, contributed to confirm it. Everything irrational which suggested itself to them appeared to their consciousness as the work and the will of the indwelling spirit. They conceived themselves, in fact, as possessed of two natures, viz. Their real proper being, the true I, and the evil spirit which subjugated them the other. And thus it happened that they spoke in the person of the evil spirit, with which they felt themselves blended into one, even in instincts and propensities utterly repugnant to their true nature. The sense of inward discord and distraction might rise to such a height as to induce the belief that they were possessed by a number of spirits, to whom they were compelled to lend their utterance. We may find a reason for the remarkable prevalence of such phenomena, at that time, not only among the Jews, but also throughout the Roman Empire, in the character of the age itself. It was an age of spiritual and physical distress, of manifold and violent disruptions, such as characterized those critical epochs in the history of the world at which, from the dissolution of all existing things, a new creation is about to unfold itself. The sway of demonism was a sign of the approaching dissolution of the whole world. Its phenomena, symptoms of the universally felt discord, were among the signs of the times which pointed to the coming of the Redeemer, who was to change that discord into harmony. The insatiable craving of want is always a precursor of the approaching supply. There lay a profound truth at the bottom of the demoniac's consciousness that his feelings, inclinations and words did not spring from his rational, God-allied nature, his true I, but from a foreign power belonging to the kingdom of the devil, evil, which had subjugated the former. And this truth offered the necessary point of contact for the operation of Christ's spiritual influence to aid the soul which longed to be delivered from its distraction and freed from its ignominious bondage. In the mind of the demoniac, the fundamental truth was inseparable from the form in which he conceived it. It was therefore necessary to seize upon the latter in order to develop the former. D. Millman. I have no scruple in avowing my opinion on the subject of the demoniacs to be that of Joseph Mead, Lardner, Dr. Mead, Paley, and all the learned modern writers. It was a kind of insanity, not unlikely to be prevalent among a people peculiarly subject to leprosy and other cutaneous diseases, and nothing was more probable than that lunacy should take the turn and speak the language of the prevailing superstition of the times. As the belief in witchcraft made people fancy themselves witches, so the belief in possession made men of distempered minds fancy themselves possessed. The demoniac mentioned in Matthew 12:22-29, seems to have suffered under infirmity rather than lunacy. The afflicted person was blind and dumb, but such cases were equally applied to malignant spirits. There is one very strong reason which may have contributed to induce Jesus to adopt the current language on this point. The disbelief in these spiritual influences was one of the characteristic tenets of the unpopular sect of the Sadducees. A departure from the common language, or the endeavor to correct the inveterate error, would have raised an immediate outcry against him from his watchful and malignant adversaries, as an unbelieving Sadducee. History of Christianity, I. 234. Dar. Roland Williams. Many persons think that, when we read in the New Testament of men being possessed by devils, we ought to understand the words in what is conceived to be their most literal sense. That is to say, that each sufferer was possessed by an evil spirit, which should in each case be considered as distinct a personal agent as the human being over whom he tyrannized. Again, on the other hand, many sober inquirers conceive the above view to be open to strong objections, both as regards the nature of the evidence on which it rests, and the moral conclusion to which it leads. They observe that all language must be interpreted according to the general habits and conceptions of the persons using it. That the phrase, demoniac possession, was commonly current in the ancient world to denote any violent form of disease, such as we now term epilepsy or mania, that manifest traces of this usage are found in Greek medical writers. And then they conceive that our Savior, instead of entering on a hopeless argument with the delusions of a maniac, removes by his gracious power the very disease which was misinterpreted. The conclusion then will be, that the words put by the sacred writers in the mouths of supposed evil spirits are merely the distorted utterances of a shattered and blinded mind. While the conception by our Savior of this popular view of the case will be merely an accommodation, such as we often find, of his own language and gesture to the usages of his country and his time. There are evil spirits of presumption, of backsliding, of doing what is right in our own eyes, of irreverence, the child of familiarity, and of a garrulous unreality in taking all holy words and things in vain. Rational Godliness, Sermon 11. Bishop Colenso. The devil a figure of speech. He that hath died hath been set free from sin, EOM. 6, 7, Dean Alford's translation. It is noticeable that St. Paul in this passage does not represent death, as a doom which God inflicts upon the race, innocent as they must be, multitudes of them, babes and others, of all wilful sin. He carefully guards his words from this. It is sin, the tyrant who inflicts it, not God, the gracious Father of spirits. It is the devil, who has the power of death, who keeps many all their lifetime subject to bondage. Of course this personification of sin is but a figure of speech. It implies that the death of the human race is a consequence of the sin in their nature, according to the moral order of the universe, not a doom which the great and blessed God, who is called in Scripture, the faithful Creator passes as a judgment upon his fallen creatures, however helpless, and innocent of real conscious guilt. Death in itself is no curse. Death was in the world for the countless races of animals and animalcules ages before man's sin. There was no sign of a curse in their death. Jastor would the death of man be attended with any notion of a curse attached to it but for the consciousness of sin. But then comes the law and brings home to our consciences the sense of sin, of evil committed against the light we had, and before the face of a most pure and holy being. And the devil, the slanderer, the accuser of God and of the brethren, makes us aware of this to fill our hearts with guilty fears, which keep us away from our Father's footstool. He teaches us thus to connect the idea of a curse with death. And many go trembling along the path of life, with the gloomy grave at the end of it, afraid to look the ghastly terror in the face. And so they turn their eyes ever to the ground as they go, and busy themselves with the petty things of this life, its business and pleasures, that they may for the present forget their fears, instead of making light of death, as they might. As they ought, and manfully pressing to do the work of their Lord. The Epistle to the Romans, 1861. The devil an actor in a story, Social Evils of Ecclesiastical Demonology. With such examples as these before us, we can scarcely doubt that the legend in the text, Matt 4. 1, with its evil spirit, speaking invisible, carrying our Lord through the air, just as we may read in many an Oriental story, setting him upon a pinnacle of the temple, and then upon the exceeding high mountain, from which all the kingdoms of the earth could be seen, had a similar origin in the imaginations of devout men. The prevalence of belief in demoniacal possessions bids me to say, shake off the incumens of that traditionary system of religious belief which prevents our standing up upon our feet as men, breathing joyously the health-giving air, the fresh inspiring life, of this our day, rejoicing in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free. Many are the stories which we may read in the records of the Church in different ages, of supposed demoniacal possession, sometimes of their cure, more frequently of diabolical punishments, inflicted by priestly power. Combined with popular ignorance, upon the unhappy victims of these absurd accusations. Open, for instance, the works of Bishop Hall. He died in 1656, a most excellent Christian. What does he say on the subject of demons? How formidable is the number of those evil and hostile spirits! Had we the eyes of holy hermits we might see the air full of those malignant spirits, laying snares for miserable mankind. And if the possessors of one poor demoniac could style themselves legion, a name that in the truest account contains no less than 10 cohorts, and every cohort 50 companies, and every company 25 soldiers. To the number of 1225, the Roman legion contained properly 6,000 soldiers. What an army of these hellish fiends do we suppose is that wherewith whole mankind is beleaguered, all the world over? Works, 8. 398. Truly the glorious and blessed world in which our Father has placed us would be a fearful place to live in, if this account were true. We might find abundant excuses for sin, if this was really our condition. We might well marvel how it should be possible for any but a very few to reach their Father's home in safety, if indeed we were exposed to such assaults as these. The belief in the reality of demoniacal possession increased more and more in the Church, and during the Middle Ages reached a frightful intensity, and indeed it has only been abolished in comparatively recent times by the light thrown upon such questions by God's blessed gift of modern science. But let the history of Christian Europe say how horrible have been the consequences when such views have been followed out to their natural results, and when that dire belief in witchcraft and sorcery, which we know prevails among the Zulus round us, filled not long ago the whole of Christian Europe with misery, malignant hate, and crimes of the blackest dye, committed for the love of God, in the name of the pitiful, compassionate Jesus. As Mr. Lecky tells us in his recent work, even Luther could say, I would have no compassion on these witches. I would burn them all while, as he also tells us, 7,000 victims are said to have been burnt at Treves, 600 by a single bishop of Bamberg, 800 in 1 year in the diocese of Würzburg, 1,000 in the province of Como, 400 at Toulouse in a single execution, 500 in 3 months at Geneva, 48 at Constance, 80 at the little town of Jalery in Savoy, 70 in Sweden. And a single judge, named Remy, boasted that he himself had been the means of putting to death in 16 years 800 witches. Natal Sermons, XX.XXII. Theodore Parker. The ecclesiastical idea of God involves the devil. In the ecclesiastical conception of God there is a deep background of evil. Now and then the mysterious cloud is miraculously lifted, and lets men see the mountain summits of anger, vengeance, jealousy and hate, and imagine the whole chain of malignity, Andes and Himalayas of wrath, hid underneath the veil. Out of this dark mass of evil in himself he created the devil, absolutely evil, and hell, both to last forever, each a finality. The devil is also a child of God, but not acknowledged, an outlying member of the divine family, the Ishmael of the universe, his hand against God, and God's against him. But after this mass of evil is subtracted and embodied in the devil, it is plain that evil still preponderates in the theological conception of God, for he does not bring the human race to a close, but still goes on creating new children of wrath. Bowed down with the sin of Adam's fall, before their birth doomed to eternal wretchedness. He might pardon, but he will not, stop creation, but he keeps the world going on, spawning whole shoals of people wherewith to fatten hell. He might at least annihilate the damned, be't even that were too merciful for his vindictive wrath. They must writhe in their agony forever. Yet, though evil so far preponderates in the ecclesiastical idea of God, as shown in his conduct, some humane mercy is also ascribed to him, with corresponding acta. He wishes to save a few brands from the burning of the world, to give some other men glimpses of a prospect of escape from ruin. So he prepares a scheme of redemption for a few, exceptions to the ruin of the rest. The devil a marplot. God cannot accomplish his purposes, the devil, his perpetual enemy, routs him in every great battle, and at last will fill an immense hell with the damned. God does not know how his own contrivance will work until set a-going, and then its wheels do not run in human history as in the divine head. Thus, the fall of Adam is as much a surprise to God as to man, only the serpent understood it beforehand. While God loves some, he hates more. Voluntarily he created the devil, who is now a being absolutely evil. The devil is not merely a mistake and failure, but an intended marplot of the universe, a premeditated contradiction. This fly in the ointment of the apothecary does no good in heaven, earth or hell, and is devised and intended for no good, helping neither any benevolent purpose of God, nor the development of man. No trace of the devil to be found anywhere. The devil, a personal being, totally and absolutely evil, with immense power which he uses to thwart God and ruin men, you find not on the face of the earth today, no footsteps of him in the old Eid sandstone. Not a track of his step amid all the vestiges of the natural history of creation. No detective police could ever find the faintest scent of this creature. Ask the minister, how do you know there is such a devil, and he answers, it is a doctrine of the divine and miraculous revelation. Ask again, how do you know the revelation is divine and miraculous, from God, and if he be an honest man and understand his profession, he will say, I do not know, I only find it convenient to assume it. Works, Trubner's edition. George Combe. Physical and mental science put Satan to flight. In the 16th and 17th centuries, divines and the people at large, both in England and Scotland, were in full possession of the Scriptures. The Reformation was completed and printing was in active operation, yet in those countries clergymen sat as judges, and condemned old women to the flames as witches. Now what was the cause of this barbarity? At that time there was neither physical nor mental science, the phenomena of nature were believed to be under the influence of magicians, of evil spirits, of the devil. And those unhappy victims of ignorance, cruelty and superstition, were believed to be in league with these powers of darkness. It was the dawn of physical philosophy which opened up the creation to the human intellect, and revealed it as the vast domain of God. Whereas before that dawn, ignorant divines, with the Bible in their hands, had mistaken it for the realm of the devil. It was science that delivered the clergy and their flocks from the practice of atrocious cruelties, from which the unaided Bible had not sufficed to protect them. It is no disparagement to the Bible to say this, because it was never intended to supersede the study of God's will as revealed in the records of creation. And in falling into superstition, the clergy and people were suffering the penalty of having omitted to discharge that duty to God and to themselves. Moral Philosophy, page 423. 1840. Chapter 11. Last words. 1. Explanatory. In sustaining the character of representing the shady side of human nature, and consequently in asserting on my own behalf the sunny side, I may have appeared to some to attenuate sin and wickedness. This I by no means have meant to do. Whether I am a personal being or not, none the less are sin and wickedness abominable and ruinous. As I in my real, that is my human relations, decline and decay, those terrors become less formidable, and when the happy day of my extinction is come, they will have disappeared. Between this and then there is a long interval. Meanwhile the old conflict has to be waged. Darkness will withstand light, and light will strive to drive darkness away. In this battle every human being must take a part, and as he sides with the one or the other, so is he great or mean, noble or ignoble, a true man or a veritable beast. In publishing this autobiography, I take my stand on the side of God, and accordingly against Satanism of all kinds and wherever found. In one sense I fight against myself. As the champion of the good qualities of the human race, and an asserter of God's everlasting verities and laws, I assail moral lawlessness as moral lawlessness, and uphold virtue and religion as virtue and religion. My great aim is to explode the shams and shows which pass under those sacred names, in order that they may be superseded by their corresponding realities. Thus I undermine myself only to own, assert and honor God. But I cannot undermine myself without directing my blows against those in high station, as well as those in low station, who nominally take as their motto, as do, for instance, the disciples of Loyola. In majorum Dei gloriam, for the greater glory of God, while all they do is of a character as if they meant, in majorum sui gloriam, their own aggrandizement, or, which is pretty much the same thing, the aggrandizement of the Pope or the priest. Whether Pope, priest, prince or populace, it is all the same to me. Hating evil, I proscribe it, loving good, I foster it. And now then I hope it will be clearly understood that I have described the innumerable evils which Satanism has produced, in order to set mankind free from those terrible harpies. Satanism once superseded, man stands in the immediate presence of his Maker. He has no cover, no pretext, no excuse for his misdeeds. Mea culpa, mine is the blame, he is compelled to feel, if not to say. No longer can he lay his wickedness to my account, no longer can he impute it to a taint of nature, or to the transgression of the founder of his family. Bearing the responsibility, he must bear the penalty also. Change your mind, or endure your punishment. This righteous law of the righteous governor of the universe he in time finds no less unchangeable than righteous. Submission ensues, and the person the tenor of whose life was a continual breach of the divine order, enters into harmony with it, and in becoming obedient, he becomes peaceful, and may ascend even into spiritual beatitude. The history of one man is the history of all men. Can so grand a result be made grander by Satanism? What then does the popular Satan but confound the great issues of the moral universe? Not a problem connected therewith, but he confuses and darkens. He is indeed the one great stumbling block of earth, whilst he is also the thundercloud which overshadows and disturbs even heaven itself. 2. To the real priests. I do not wish to part with you in anger. I have said plain things of you and to you. You have done the same by me. Perhaps, could we count and weigh offences, those for which I am answerable are neither greater in number nor more weighty. However, as I wish to shake hands before we part, I ask pardon if I have been over-severe. Doubtless we shall meet again, but in which world I will not presume to determine. But wherever it may be, I should not like that either of us should be full of enmity. However, to shew my goodwill, I take my leave of you with a word or two of advice. Beyond a doubt, if my reign is over, yours is coming to an end. When I am gone, your case will be desperate. And going I really am. Do you not see that, whereas I used to be everywhere, now I am all but nowhere? The literary men treat me with the intense scorn of utter silence. Even in novels I am of no service. Moral philosophy simply ignores me. Men of science smile when my name is mentioned. I am utterly banished from good society. Not even as an expletive is my name used, except, it may be, by thick-headed squires or frequenters of taprooms. Nay, all the higher religious literature is exempt from even an allusion to me. I am, however, turned to some account in certain pulpits, but their quality does but measure the thoroughness of my decay. Under these circumstances, I seriously advise you to renounce the devil and all his works / not in word, but in deed. Depend upon it, if you cling to me much longer, you will not save me from the approaching billows, but inevitably you will be submerged yourselves. Farewell, I hear the soughing of the incoming ocean, save yourselves. Farewell. 3. My claim on the gratitude of the human race. If I know myself, I have not, in preparing these memoirs for the press, been actuated by any form of gross selfishness. I shall not then tarnish my repute with posterity by here at the last putting forward any claim to superior merit. But I do ask for gratitude. I have certainly aimed to render some service to mankind. I have witnessed the crushing load of evil under which they groaned of yore through the use that was made of me and my alleged appurtenances. I leave the world in a measure relieved. To that most desirable result this autobiography will, I hope, conduce in some measure. If, then, I am not mistaken, I have conferred some good on the human race. Let it be acknowledged. Not on my account, for I have no longer any vivid interest in anything done under the sun, but as a proof that at any rate the vice of ingratitude no longer infests the world. That extinct, a pregnant excuse for believing in my existence will exist no longer. The service I have rendered, if any, I have no wish to exaggerate. The monstrosities occasioned through me by my abettors, denote and measure the amount of distress and woe men have in consequence endured. As is the malignity of the disease, so is the benefit of the cure. Every preceding page declares the two either implicitly or explicitly. 4. The epic closes. Yes. Nothing less than the grand and awful conflict which has from the earliest ages proceeded on this globe between good and evil, conscience and ill-regulated desire, obedience and disobedience, regard to God's eternal laws and disregard of them. Have we, gentle Eater, been surveying under the old and once recognized antithesis of God and Satan, from which the latter member has been eliminated, leaving God, and God alone, as the one supreme creator, governor and benefactor of the universe. Yet the ancient contrariety, changed in form, remains in substance, and must remain, until sin and death, man's great and last enemies, are slain, when God shall be all in all. 1 Cor 15. 24. Seek. Meanwhile, alas for those that withstand the divine will and power, whether by taking part with moral evil, or by giving support to theological falsity. Yet they too will finally be made concurrent elements in the universal harmony, even if necessary, by the severest discipline, for the Almighty either cannot, and will not, be foiled in his purposes of love toward his children of the human race. The Saviour comes. By ancient bards foretold. Hear him, ye deaf. And all ye blind, behold. He from thick films shall purge the visual ray, and on the sightless eyeball pour the day. 'Tis he obstructed paths of sound shall clear, and bid new music charm unfolding ear. The dumb shall sing, the lame his crutch forego, and leap exulting like the bounding roe. No sigh, no murmur, the wide world shall hear. From every face he wipes off every tear. In adamantine chains shall death be bound, and hell's grim tyrant feel eternal wound. As the good shepherd tends his fleecy care, seeks freshest pasture and the purest air, explores the lost, the wandering sheep directs. By day coerces them, and by night protects. The tender lambs he raises in his arms, feeds from his hand and in his bosom warms. Thus shall mankind his guardian care engage, the promised father of the future age. Pope. My dissolution, to which I have repeatedly pointed, is actually portended in a Teutonic myth relating to myself. The legend runs to this effect. On a certain occasion I came upon a man who was making buttons. Struck by the singularity of the employment, I asked him, "What are you doing?" "I am making eyes. Mine are nearly worn out, can you supply me with a new pair?" "Come again this day month and you shall know." I kept the appointment and repeated my question. "Yes, but you must first submit to be bound." "A small price," I replied, "for so great a good." Thereupon I was bound. Then the operator, having me in his power, poured melted lead into my eyeballs. Tortured and enraged, I made a tremendous effort and tore myself loose. Rushing over a field, I met some peasants. "What is the matter?" they asked. "Who is that villain?" was my reply. "His name is Self." Would I had dashed out his brains before I underwent the operation. Then, was the taunt, you would have performed the wise operation of braining yourself. For to your own stupidity you owe your wounds. Tradition makes me to have died of my agonies. Tradition, as often, is here incorrect. And yet it did not speak in vain, for it teaches that wickedness is self-destructive infatuation. And so, though I still linger on in life, I know that my days are numbered. 5. Great Pan is dead. Epithases, pupil of Cleombrotus, having, according to Plutarch, embarked with several others on board a vessel in order to sail to Italy, found himself in a dead calm near one of the islands of the Aegean Sea. While most of the passengers were indulging in wine after supper, a voice was suddenly heard from the island. It called out the name of the pilot, Thomas, so loud as to alarm everyone in the ship. The pilot not having replied, the same voice, only in a louder and more penetrating tone, bade him on reaching a certain port announce these words, "Great Pan is dead." Amazement brought a number of persons around Thomas. What would he do? What ought to be done? A kind of spontaneous council resolved that if the wind was strong enough to carry the vessel beyond the island, the fact should be accounted a divine indication that the voice was no illusion. The wind sank more and more as the ship neared the island, and at last, passing on, gently glided into the intended port. No sooner was the anchor cast than Thomas shouted out, "Great Pan is dead." The words echoed from the vessel to the shore, from the shore to the neighboring range of hills, from the hills it ran through the valleys. The valleys sent it into the villages, and the villages united to transmit it to the capital, where it was taken up and reverberated by man, woman and child, all over the surface of the city. Until the sounds gathered into one assemblage which proclaimed in tones of thunder the fearful word, "Great Pan is dead." The proclamation was followed by wailings and groanings innumerable, until the air was filled with grief and woe, when of a sudden a dense and widely spread cloud arose which shrouded the heavens above and made dark night universal. This ancient legend betokens the intense attachment which the sons of men have felt for me. The product of their own infirmities, I have been the object of their love and even of their worship. Living in those, their deep and ineradicable affections, I have been able to disregard decay and defy dissolution. But the breezes of a new spirit are beginning to blow. The vessel in which I sail is carried past the sleepy island, and already she is standing out into the main of human intelligence and pure religion. The air is too aerial and elastic for my lungs. I fetch my breath with difficulty, and already am so much reduced in strength, that I can only murmur out the announcement. Great Pan is dead. Farewell, my children. You have become adult, and henceforwards will do far better without me than you did while under my inspiration. Farewell. Farewell. Satan. 6. The pith of the volume. Sin's sick and offa thing. And I hay sinned sae often and sae lang, that maybe he'll be forced eftera, to send me to the bottomless pit. Hoot, hoot, Tamaz. Dinna spake sick awful things, said Dow. They're dreadfew to hearken till. I's warran he's as kinhurtle as Yersel. I said, he might be forced to send me eftera. What, Tamaz, cried Couples. He couldna save ye. Why, the Son and the Spirit to help him. And a willin hurt in you forby. Fags. Ye hae a greater opinion o, Satan nor I jide ye the discredit o. Ka, na, it's nae Satan. It's mysel. I wadna lay mair white yupo Satan's shout hers nor es his ein. He has enuch already, puir fallow. Ye'll be o, all the Obbie Burns's opinion, that he Ablins micht still hae a stake. Na, he has nane. Burns was nae prophet. But just suppose, Tamaz, gin the Dael was to repent. Man, exclaimed the stonemason, rising to his full height with slow labor after the day's toil, it wad be cruel to gar repent. It wad be our sare upon him. Better kill him. The bitterness o, sick repentance wad be our terrible. It wad be mair nor he could bide. It wad brack his hurt athegither. Ha, na, he has nae chance. Who ken ye that? Asked Couples. There's no sick word I, the scripture. Do we think he maun tell us a thing? We hae nae richt to think anything that he does na tells. Fm nae sae sure o that, Tamaz. Maybe, whiles, he does not tell's a thing just to gar, think about it, and be ready for the time when he will tell's. George MacDonald.